Chapter 1833. Take ordinary living creatures as an example. Read the latest chapter in full. Read the latest chapter in full. As soon as they were born, they were bound by countless restrictions. The most obvious one was the restriction of power. Almost all living creatures were extremely weak when they were born. Without the protection of other living creatures, they would not be able to live for long. That was the restriction of power. It was precisely because they were weak that they fell into such a predicament. For living creatures to survive, they had to first break the restriction and obtain enough power to survive. After that, living creatures obtained the ability to survive on their own. Although they had broken the restriction of power and did not need the protection of other living creatures to survive. However, did this mean that there were no other restraints? The rules of society, the rules of civilization, and so on were also restraining them. If they did not have enough power, they would gradually be worn down by these rules. They would either die, or they would eventually become someone else. This required them to continue to pursue power, to improve themselves, and to reach a higher level. Evidently, every level of power had its own rules. In other words, every level of power had its own restrictions. In order to break the restrictions, they had to continue to improve and transcend the level of power. That was how the path of cultivation for living creatures was formed. The instinct to break the restrictions was transcendence. This was the root of cultivation for all living creatures. It was the fundamental desire for growth for all living creatures. Because of this instinct, it did not matter to any living creature what the higher level of the world was like, whether there were any restrictions, or whether it was as beautiful as the legends said. For them, the higher level of the world was not beautiful. It only meant that it was only a halfway point on the path of transcendence, a transit point. After this conversation, Meow had an inexplicable change. The way he looked at the other living creatures on the path of transcendence was no longer as arrogant as before. Instead, there was a hint of admiration and pity in his eyes. Compared to the other living creatures, the three of them did not have to take many detours with Luo Fan leading them. Along the way, their speed was naturally much faster than that of the other cultivators at the Supreme Emperor realm. Let's not talk about other things. This could be seen from the fact that they had traversed a distance that other beings would need billions of trillions of years to traverse in such a short period of time. This was a path of transcendence, a wonderful way to return home. Similarly, it was also a path for her to transcend herself and improve herself. As she kept moving forward, and as she saw more and more creatures who were pursuing transcendence, her understanding of cultivation and transcendence became deeper and deeper. One day, when Meow stepped into a space-time dimension and saw a Supreme Emperor emitting an extremely unwilling transcendence intent at the last moment of his death, countless waves suddenly surged around Meow's body. As these waves moved, the surrounding space-time dimensions instantly began to undergo endless changes. Faintly, all sorts of mysterious things formed around her, constantly changing and changing. At the same time, his body began to expand rapidly. The many space-time dimensions that made up his body began to disperse, gradually forming an indescribable flow with the many space-time dimensions around him. She's broken through? At this moment, a look of surprise appeared on Emptiness's face. She came to Luo Fan's side. Looks like she's broken through. Luo Fan smiled faintly. Countless pieces of information flashed in his eyes. The endless changes that were happening inside Meow's body at this moment were reflected in his eyes. Through his eyes, they were transmitted directly to the bottom of his heart, allowing him to have a deeper understanding of the various changes that were happening to Meow in the process of continuous analysis. To read the latest chapter of this book, please search 800. To read the latest chapter of this book, please go to This Doesn't Look Like a Sign of Breaking Through to the False Saint Realm and Becoming a Desperado. Could it be that she's becoming a Supreme Emperor? Emptiness frowned. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Of course not becoming a Supreme Emperor. The breakthrough that she's undergoing right now doesn't correspond to the cultivation realm that we know. It should be a kind of breakthrough that only exists in higher space-time dimensions. That should be a kind of breakthrough that only exists in higher space-time dimensions. Kong Nu nodded in understanding when she heard this. At this moment, the endless space-time dimensions around Wen Miao's body began to vibrate rapidly. Vaguely, an unknown number of space-time dimensions were born out of thin air, gradually pushing and fusing with the surrounding space-time dimensions. Following this change, Wen Miao's body gradually became illusory. In the end, after an unknown period of time, her body completely disappeared and could no longer be found. One could only vaguely sense her aura in the surrounding endless space-time dimensions. If an ordinary person were to see such a change, they would probably think that Wen Miao had failed his breakthrough and had died, completely merging into the surrounding space-time dimensions. However, the people here were not ordinary people. The people here were Luo Fan and Kong Nu, who had seen a lot of things. Naturally, they would not be misled like ordinary people. At this moment, the two of them were quite clear that Wen Miao had not failed his breakthrough. He was still in the process of breaking through. At this moment, although she had merged with the surrounding space-time dimension, her fundamental essence still existed. She was still going through some kind of mysterious, indescribable transformation. Once this transformation was successful, Wen Miao would definitely be countless times stronger than before. The two of them were very patient, especially Luo Fan. He could even equate an instant with countless trillions of years. Naturally, he would not feel impatient because the transformation was too slow. Although the Emptiness Lady was not like Luo Fan, who could completely ignore the passage of time, she was already satisfied with having Luo Fan by her side. No matter how long she had to wait, she would only feel satisfied and happy. Naturally, she would not be impatient. Just like that, the two of them waited here for 1,000,000 years. During these 1,000,000 years, this space-time dimension fragment seemed to have completely separated itself from the path of transcendence. No cultivator could step into this place anymore. In this space-time dimension fragment, there were only the three of them. On this day, 1,000,000 years after Wen Miao disappeared, this space-time dimension fragment suddenly began to shake rapidly. A repulsive force began to act on Luo Fan and Kong Nu. This repulsive force was not too strong. It was a bit of a problem for Kong Nu, but for Luo Fan, if he wanted to resist it, this repulsive force would not affect him at all. However, Luo Fan, who felt this repulsive force, had no intention of resisting it, because he could feel that this repulsive force was quite gentle. However, it was not the kind of violent repulsive force. At this moment, he had a guess in his heart. Perhaps Wen Miao's transformation required them to leave. Therefore, he did not resist this repulsive force, and took Kong Nu with him to leave this space-time dimension fragment. Outside the space-time dimension fragment, there was a strange nothingness. The reason why this nothingness was called strange was that behind this nothingness, there was some kind of strange space-time dimension that would change from time to time. It would either appear, collapse, or distort. Some would even move, making it look extremely lively. In other words, this kind of nothingness was only nothingness from a normal point of view. If one looked at it from a different angle, using the space-time dimension's perspective, this nothingness, it was completely an extremely lively sea of space-time dimension. At this moment, Luo Fan and Kong Nu were standing on a reef in this sea. In front of them, there was a sea that was different from other places, and it was undergoing some kind of extremely deep and mysterious change. The entire space-time dimension fragment was constantly expanding and strengthening. From the looks of it, this region of the sea was continuously expanding. It was constantly strengthening. This kind of expansion and strengthening speed was extremely fast. It had even surpassed time. In just a blink of an eye, it had already grown from the original appearance of a fragment into a complete space-time dimension. A space-time dimension that was completely different from any space-time dimension that Luo Fan knew of. This complete space-time dimension was similar to the space-time dimension that completely belonged to him around his body, but there were more differences. It was more complete than the unique space-time dimension around his body. It was more tenacious and more indestructible. After the space-time dimension appeared, it emitted endless rays of light. This kind of light could only be seen from the space-time dimension's perspective. From a normal point of view, it was still nothingness in front of them. As soon as the light appeared, a faintly discernible sun appeared high up in the sky. The sun was also emitting light and resonating with it. At first glance, it seemed that the light in front of them was trying its best to absorb the light emitted by that sun. This process didn't last long. In the blink of an eye, the sun and the space-time dimension in front of them had completely disappeared. After that sun appeared for a moment, it had already disappeared into the boundless nothingness, and it could no longer be found. That's the higher space-time dimension? Kong Nu murmured. There was an inexplicable shock in her eyes. Just now, when that sun appeared, she felt an indescribable spiritual pressure shrouding her body. This kind of spiritual pressure made her feel as if she couldn't bear the sun in the next moment. She felt as if she would melt and die under the sun's light in the next moment. This was the first time that she had encountered such an existence. Even the life-saving means that the true saint had left behind when she had met the true saint were many times worse than this. Therefore, how could she not be shocked? Perhaps the immortal dimension, Permitha, is a more suitable name for that place, Kong Nu murmured in shock. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, that should be the higher space-time dimension. It's not wrong to call it the immortal dimension, Permitha. However, if it's really a high and mighty place that people worship, then there's no need for it. Kong Nu came back to her senses and said with a little shame, that's right. No matter what, it's just a place with a higher space-time dimension. Not to mention other things, just the big world alone is much stronger than it. At this moment, the complete space-time dimension in front of them began to gradually converge and condense. After a short while, it condensed into a human figure. Naturally, it was a Miao. At this moment, Miao was much more noble and mysterious than before. Strands of space-time dimension revolved around her, faintly forming an unknown number of lights and shadows. It was as if she was formed by countless space-time dimension fragments. As for the seal that Luo Fan had set up to control space-time dimension, it had completely disappeared at this moment. The feeling of the higher space-time dimension emitted from her body was more than 10,000 times stronger than before. It felt as if she could even fight with Luo Fan at this moment. It seems that you've improved a lot. Luo Fan sighed at this moment. It's all thanks to your guidance. If it wasn't for your guidance, I would have needed 10,000 times more time to reach this step. I'm afraid I'll need tens of thousands of times more time, Miao said. As she spoke, the various strange phenomena around her body gradually converged. Not long after, it had completely vanished, causing her to look as if she had returned to her original appearance. There was nothing abnormal about her anymore. What's the specific cultivation method of your higher space-time dimension? Empyrean asked at this moment. Although they had known each other for a long time, it had always been Miao asking about the cultivation method. Empyrean had never asked about Miao's cultivation system. You finally asked. I've been waiting for you to take the initiative to ask. I've been waiting for nearly 100 million years, Miao said with a smile. No matter how indifferent Empyrean was, she couldn't help but roll her eyes at this moment. Miao smiled and said, it's not a secret. If you want to know, I'll tell you. We are living beings of higher space-time dimension. We are formed based on the space-time dimension, which is invisible to you. To us, the space-time dimension is equivalent to power to you. Therefore, our cultivation is to increase the space-time dimension. However, there are two directions for this kind of cultivation. One is the direction of purity, that is to improve the core space-time dimension at the time of its birth, so that it can continue to grow until it reaches the end and transcends, achieving a level that I still can't understand. The other direction is the direction of broadness. The cultivation of this direction is to keep mastering more and more types of space-time dimensions. Finally, with the help of these more and more space-time dimensions, one can sublimate oneself and reach a level that I still can't understand with a different path. Hearing this, Empyrean recalled Meow's various breakthroughs. She suddenly understood and said, "It seems that you have chosen the second direction?" Meow nodded and said, "That's right. The first direction is too pure and requires giving up too many things. I can't do it at all. Therefore, I can only choose the second direction." A truly complete space-time dimension was formed by the condensation of countless changes in space-time dimensions. Meow's previous breakthrough was to turn herself into a complete space-time dimension. Of course, that was the second direction. Being able to turn herself into a complete space-time dimension meant that Meow had now completed the first step of cultivation in the second direction. She had truly laid the foundation for her future transcendence. From now on, all she could do was to continuously nurture this space-time dimension and incorporate more changes in space-time dimensions into it. She would do everything possible to strengthen and strengthen this space-time dimension until it reached an unimaginable level and truly transcend. As for the first direction that she could choose before this, it was no longer fated with her. At this time, Luo Fan said, "Now that you have broken through, is there a way to directly construct a path to the higher space-time dimension?" Meow listened and sensed for a while. She sighed and said, "No. The higher space-time dimension is too far away from here. With my current strength, I can't directly construct a path to go there." Can't directly construct a path? That is to say, there's another way to speed up? Luo Fan understood the meaning behind her words and said, "That's right. Although I can't directly construct a path, I can't. Although I can't directly construct a path, I can guide the way and return to the higher space-time dimension as quickly as possible." Meow smiled and said, "What's the difference between this and the previous one? Before this, we used the shortest path to go forward, right?" Kong Nu frowned and said, "This is not the same. The straight line before was just the shortest path from the perspective of the lower space-time dimension. It's not really the shortest path." Meow smiled and said, the moment these words left his mouth, Luo Fan and Kong Nu came to a sudden realization. Looking at the world from a different angle would result in a completely different world. For example, in the eyes of ordinary people, space was space. If one wanted to go from one point in space to another point in space, the shortest path was to draw a straight line between the 2 points. However, in the eyes of living beings with spatial abilities, the shortest distance was obviously on another level. The standard of measurement had also changed from the original straight line length to the amount of energy needed to cross the space between 2 points. Chapter 1834. Immediately, Meow closed her eyes. Her body became a little blurry, as if her entire body was about to collapse and melt. She only recovered after a long while. Then, she suddenly raised her hand and pointed downwards. In an instant, a sparkling light appeared tens of thousands of miles below the three of them. The light was extremely weak. If it was an ordinary cultivator, they would not be able to see the light at all. However, this was not a problem for Luo Fan and the air hostess. With their sensing abilities, even if the light was tens of thousands of times smaller, they would still be able to discover it instantly and lock onto it. "It's actually in that direction." Luo Fan sighed. This situation was a little beyond his expectations. The place where the light was shining was clearly the direction where they had come from. This was the complete opposite of what he had expected, where he would head straight for the higher space-time dimensions. Even he couldn't completely ignore it. After sighing, the three of them took a step forward and arrived at the place where the light was. After arriving, the light jumped and disappeared again. It shifted to another direction, tens of thousands of miles away. However, this direction was no longer downward, but upward. Just like that, the three of them began to move in an extremely complicated and winding route in the sea of the higher space-time dimension. Although this route seemed to have taken many turns compared to the straight route they had taken previously, the three of them felt that the speed at which they were approaching the higher space-time dimension was constantly increasing. In just a few days, they felt that they had already crossed a distance that would have taken them millions of years to cross, and so on and so forth. After walking for 100 years, the light finally stopped in front of them. "We've arrived?" The air hostess frowned slightly. Looking at the scenery around them that was completely the same as the rest of the place, she was a little surprised. She was a little confused and a little disappointed. If the route they had taken in the past 100 years were to be connected in a line, it would simply become the most complicated and chaotic mess in the world. However, if they had walked in a straight direction, it would have taken them more than 100 years to reach this place. However, the time required was definitely not just 100 years. Instead, it might take hundreds of billions of years. After walking such a long distance and arriving at the place where the light had stopped, she saw a scene that was completely the same as the other places. Even though she was Air Maiden, she felt a little frustrated. Meow looked around and nodded. "It should be around here." At this time, Luo Fan's perception spread out and began to sweep in all directions and levels of this space-time dimensional ocean. In an instant, a smile appeared on his face. He said, "It should be here." Who would have thought that there would be so many existences that have crossed the path of transcendence and come to this position that is so close to the end? These words, Meow and Air Maiden couldn't help but reveal surprised expressions. Luo Fan's words clearly indicated that he had discovered something. However, they couldn't sense what they had discovered at all. This naturally made them curious. Luo Fan nodded. He raised his hand and pointed at a certain spot in the void. In the blink of an eye, the space-time dimension distorted and changed, revealing a path that led to an extremely special space-time dimension. This path was born from nothingness and extended into the depths of nothingness. The space-time dimension that appeared at the end of the path, although it was extremely mysterious, it was clearly not the higher space-time dimension. Instead, it was a space-time dimension that was constructed by countless space-time dimensions in an extremely strange way. It seemed to be a complete space-time dimension, but it also seemed to be missing an extremely important part. There was a faint aura that Luo Fan had only sensed from Meow. This was the aura of the higher space-time dimension. It was not the higher space-time dimension, but it had the aura of the higher space-time dimension. Therefore, it could be imagined that the space-time dimension must be extremely close to the higher space-time dimension. Because of this, Luo Fan made the previous judgment. As expected, it's very close. Meow also had an extremely joyful expression at this time. With a slight thought, she had already crossed that path and stepped into that space-time dimension. As soon as she stepped into it, she took a deep breath. Her face was filled with nostalgia and intoxication. This aura of the higher space-time dimension was the aura of home to her. It went without saying how wonderful it felt to be able to sense the aura of home again after being separated from it for billions of years. Luo Fan and Empty Maiden had also crossed the path and stepped into this space-time dimension. This space-time dimension looked like a complete space-time dimension. It contained everything that a normal space-time dimension had, but there was an essential difference between what it showed and the normal space-time dimension. In the space-time dimension, there were endless living beings. Among them, some of the characteristics of the living beings were similar to a Meow, but also similar to ordinary living beings with flesh and blood. They seemed to be in between, but also seemed to be in the middle state of transforming from living beings with flesh and blood to living beings with dimensions. These countless living beings formed a complete civilized society. Among them, the vast majority were ordinary living beings that were completely attached to all the rules of the space-time dimension. They lived in this world according to the rules. But among them, there were also countless extremely powerful living beings. Among them, the powerful ones didn't feel any worse than Luo Fan at this time. Moreover, the most powerful living beings exuded an unimaginable sense of vicissitudes. Even the most ordinary living beings could clearly tell that they had lived for countless years and had seen countless births, aging, illnesses, and deaths. I didn't expect another Taoist to come to this step. At this moment, a voice was heard from the void and transmitted into the ears of Luo Fan and the other two. As soon as this voice appeared, Luo Fan locked onto the speaker. It was said by the most powerful living being in this space-time dimension. That living being looked like a young man on the surface. However, the vicissitudes of time in his eyes were enough to shock anyone. Based on Luo Fan's senses, it was impossible for him to accumulate such a terrifying feeling of vicissitudes. Based on what he could sense, it was impossible for him to accumulate such a terrifying feeling of vicissitudes. With such vicissitudes of time, if a living being was not strong enough, they would definitely fall into his eyes. They would be contaminated by the vicissitudes of time, and eventually, their minds would be completely melted. In the end, they would sink into it and die of exhaustion. However, to Luo Fan and the others, this only made them sigh inwardly. It was impossible for it to have any real impact on them. I wonder how many years it took for you to reach this place? That person asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, millions of years. Millions of years. Hearing this, the person's body trembled, and in a flash, he appeared directly in front of Luo Fan and the others through the space-time dimension. You actually only spent millions of years to reach this place. You must have a way to the other side. I wonder if you can take it out, and let me have a look. An indescribable light flashed in the young man's eyes. At this moment, hundreds of thousands of densely packed figures gathered from all over the space-time dimension. In the blink of an eye, they appeared in the surroundings and directly surrounded Luo Fan and the others. Every single one of these living beings was not inferior to the young man, and every single one of their eyes revealed an indescribable vicissitudes of time. Clearly, every single one of them had lived for billions of trillions of years. It seems that everyone has been paying attention to us at all times. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but smile. The living beings here made up nearly half of the powerful beings that existed in this world. At this moment, their combined aura was so powerful that it could even distort the space-time dimension, causing the surrounding space-time dimension to undergo some indescribable change. Countless space-time dimensions were born as a result, filling the surroundings. Moreover, it changed the surroundings. If the power of these living beings could be combined as a whole, they would probably be tens of thousands of times more powerful than Luo Fan. Of course, this was purely in terms of power. If they were to fight, with Luo Fan's cultivation realm being much higher than theirs, it would only take him a few moves to annihilate them. Since this friend was able to come here, he must have the intention of transcending and is on the same path as us. One of the living beings said, That's right. However, since he has a guide, then he must contribute it so that we can all break through that door and truly step on the other side, instead of lingering in this place that is neither up nor down, forever unable to transcend. Another living being said, That's right. Friend, hurry up and hand over the guide. For a moment, a buzzing sound exploded in the surroundings. Waves of increasingly powerful auras began to press down on where Luo Fan and the others were from all directions. A kind of more and more obvious malice began to be gradually released from it, causing Luo Fan's brows to gradually wrinkle. Have you all reached a consensus? Luo Fan asked plainly. Originally, he had the intention to converse with these living beings and understand what was going on in this space-time dimension. He also wanted to understand how to break through this space-time dimension and step onto the so-called other shore, which was the higher space-time dimension. However, from the looks of it now, they clearly didn't care and wanted to force him to hand over the so-called guide to the higher space-time dimension. This naturally made it impossible for him to be as kind as before. Please forgive us, fellow Taoist. We've already stayed here for far too long. Before us, there were countless seniors who perished because they couldn't find any hope. We can't wait any longer. The young man who spoke first said. In his eyes, there was an indescribable greed and expectation. The way he looked at Luo Fan was not as if he was looking at a so-called fellow Taoist, but more like a miser looking at a warehouse full of gold and silver treasures. Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed and said, It seems like there's nothing to talk about. Anyway, whatever I want to know, I just have to take it from your hearts. At that moment, he grabbed the young man in front of him. Although the surrounding living beings originally thought that they would definitely win and that Luo Fan would definitely not be able to resist their will, each of them was a powerful existence that had trekked from below for billions of trillions of years after all. They already had incomparably rich battle experience. Naturally, they would pay attention to Luo Fan's actions. At this moment, when Luo Fan made his move, one by one, they all made their moves. In an instant, an unknown amount of light was released from their bodies. With all sorts of mysterious power that belonged to the space-time dimension, they blasted towards Luo Fan. This kind of bombardment looked extremely terrifying and extremely violent. However, the changes contained within were extremely deep and unfathomable. Moreover, it didn't just contain that kind of destructive might. It also contained countless mysterious changes. If this bombardment really took effect, then Luo Fan and the others would not die, but they would completely seal off any power that could possibly resist. They would completely become fish on the chopping board, with no possibility of escaping. Facing such a terrifying bombardment, even though Luo Fan had already gone through the second Great Tribulation, he could not ignore it. With a slight thought, he stopped grabbing the young man with one hand, turned around, and casually pulled the surroundings. In an instant, the surrounding space-time dimension changed, forming a substitute that directly condensed in front of him. It replaced everything about him and threw itself into the unknown amount of light. Chi, the countless changes in the light erupted in an instant. All the light converged billions of times faster than the normal light converged. In just an instant, everything had already calmed down. The substitute of Luo Fan was already standing quietly in the void. Inside and outside of his body, up and down, whether it was real or abstract, whether it was real or illusory. Everything had been frozen. Luo Fan glanced over. One could see tens of thousands of mysterious space-time dimensions inside his body. He had used all sorts of indescribable methods to completely seal it, although it's ingenious enough. However, the level is still too low. Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. Then, he casually made a grabbing motion, and the youth was already in his hand. Throughout the entire process, the youth instinctively wanted to resist. Countless space-time dimensions exploded in his resistance, creating an unfathomably terrifying and astonishing power. However, all of this was completely destroyed by Luo Fan's subtle changes. In the end, he was like an ordinary person without any power and fell directly into Luo Fan's hands. At this moment, the other living beings seemed to have woken up from a dream, and they realized that they had been tricked. All of their faces changed drastically. In an instant, more than half of the living beings once again unleashed their attacks, enveloping Luo Fan. However, some of them had already regained their rationality. They stopped their attacks and stared at Luo Fan, who was in the center, grimly. Due to this divergence, the various attacks that were directed at Luo Fan became nearly half as powerful as before. Although the changes were increasingly ingenious, they still posed no threat to Luo Fan. This time, he did not even need to send out his substitute. He only gently pulled in the void with one hand, and strands of space-time dimensions fluttered and squirmed like living creatures under his control. In the blink of an eye, they brazenly plunged into the terrifying light that everyone had gathered to attack him. Amidst the various subtle changes, all the light collapsed in the blink of an eye, and the surroundings regained their original state. At this moment, what was imprinted in the eyes of Luo Fan and the others were faces of disbelief and traces of remorse. At this moment, Luo Fan could no longer be bothered with them. Although their attacks seemed to be extremely well coordinated, and their combined power seemed to be incredibly terrifying, it was impossible for them to truly merge as one. As long as they did not truly merge as one, they would no longer pose any threat to him. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. He extended his will and began to attack the will of the living being in his hand, and he began to read its technique. Although the young man was young, He had already spent who knew how many trillion years to reach this space-time dimension from the bottom. Such a person like him had rich experience and a firm will, which went without saying. Even if Luo Fan's level was much higher than his, and he could absolutely crush him in terms of cultivation realm, he still couldn't break through his willpower defense, and couldn't truly read his skills. But there are many redeeming qualities. A thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he faced this scene. Although he could not break through the will's defense and read its technique, he still had the absolute upper hand in the end. In the end, the situation was still constantly changing in his favor. As such, he could be so relaxed, but the young man could not. At this moment, the young man seemed to have really returned to his youth, when he still had no power at all. In his senses, a terrifying power that was as vast as the sky and as deep as the abyss was constantly attacking his will, crushing all his resistance. It made him feel as if he was being cut into pieces at every moment. How can he be so powerful? His eyes had already become empty and vacant. Other than his instinctive determination to resist, this was the only thought left in his mind. Chapter 1835. Although this person had a firm will, strength was still strength. Luo Fan didn't even need to show his life source, which was the manifestation of his worldview. He just needed to integrate a trace of the worldview's characteristics into his will, and that was enough to defeat the other party's will and completely integrate his sea of memories into his own senses. The whole process was straightforward, and compared with the previous difficulty, it formed a shocking contrast. It was as if the other party's will had suddenly turned from diamond to tofu. So that's how it is. After casually flipping through it, Luo Fan already understood the various aspects of this space-time dimension. He also knew where the door they were talking about was, and what was behind the door. That portal was an abstract portal. The reason why it appeared was not natural, but because in this space-time dimension, from ancient times to the present, the thoughts and wishes of countless trillions of living beings had unknowingly changed the composition of the space-time dimension and naturally condensed into this abstract portal. This abstract portal didn't have a real entity. However, all living beings knew that as long as they broke through this portal, they would step into the other shore and enter the immortal dimension. This portal was actually formed by the will of all living beings. After understanding the truth of the portal, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inexplicably. The essence of the space-time dimension had been changed, and even the connection between this space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimension had been directly changed, turning it into an abstract portal. How many living beings had existed in this space-time dimension since ancient times, and how strong their obsession with the higher space-time dimension was. Even Luo Fan clearly knew that this was brought about by their cultivation instincts. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little shocked. Since he already knew what he wanted to know, the young man in his hands was no longer of any use to him. At this moment, as soon as Luo Fan loosened his grip, the young man fell. It looked like he was about to smash into the ground below. It was a strange ground formed by the accumulation of countless space-time dimensions. It was crystal clear, faintly revealing countless lights and shadows and countless auras. It had all kinds of mysterious and profound characteristics. At this moment, the young man's eyes narrowed, and his body collapsed with a loud bang. Then, he completely disappeared. Moments later, not far away, among the crowd, the young man's figure condensed again. It looked as if nothing had happened. It looked exactly the same as before. There was no difference at all. This situation caused everyone's expression to change slightly. Any one of the hundreds of thousands of experts here was a powerful existence that was by no means simple or ordinary. Their strength could be placed in any world or even any space-time dimension. They were all terrifying existences that could suppress the heavens and earth. Such an existence, foresight, eyesight. Naturally, his strength was beyond imagination. Perhaps they didn't understand what had happened earlier at the beginning, but after a few glances and deductions, they naturally understood everything clearly. They understood that what Luo Fan had done earlier was to search the memories of this young man before them. It was because they knew this that they were so shocked and wary of Luo Fan. That was why it had risen to such an astonishing level. Every living being's memory was a sacred and inviolable part of them. For them, even if he were to lose his life, he would never be willing to lose his memories. Under such a situation, if they allowed their memories to be searched by other living beings, that would be the greatest offense to them. Any cultivator would definitely resist with their lives on the line. In fact, they would rather perish indiscriminately than allow the other party to casually search their memories. Every cultivator had such a mentality. The young man before them was no exception. Therefore, in their opinion, the young man before them must have fought back with his life when his memories were being searched. In the end, even if he couldn't fight back, he would definitely cause unimaginable harm to himself. It was even possible that he would be completely destroyed. It was impossible for him to be unharmed. There was only one situation where there was an exception. That was the existence that was searching this young man's memories was countless times stronger than him. It was even so strong that it could completely suppress his desperate resistance and completely subdue his desire to die together. Only in this way could such a situation occur. With this understanding, their estimation of Luo Fan's strength naturally rose greatly once again. I have no conflict with any of you, Luo Fan said faintly. If you want to get something from me, unless I'm willing, no one can do it. So disperse. As he spoke, he waved his hand, and the endless space-time dimensions around him began to surge rapidly, forming a space-time dimensional wave that swept towards the many experts in all directions. This high-level use of space-time dimensions was what Luo Fan comprehended from Miao. Just this use alone was already many times more profound than the space-time dimensions that the many living beings in the space-time dimension had comprehended out of thin air at this moment. At this moment, even though he had only consumed a little bit of energy, the terrifying might that was produced was enough to shock everyone. Although they believed that if they joined forces, they would still have a chance to resist the space-time dimensional waves and escape from this situation, it was impossible for them to do so. However, don't forget that Luo Fuan just waved his hand casually and used a little of his power. So what if they could resist this space-time dimensional wave? Immediately, everyone quickly dodged in horror. In the blink of an eye, there were only a few powerful creatures left. The other hundreds of thousands of creatures had all disappeared. Why aren't you guys leaving? When Miao looked at the remaining creatures and asked curiously with a frown. Hearing this, the 8 beings who were already outside the range of the waves glanced at each other and bowed to Luo Fan and the others, saying, "We are willing to become your followers. I only wish to enter the other side." Followers. This was a rule that existed in almost every world. Actually, it was just a euphemism for a servant. He looked at the expressions of the 8 of them. At first, when Miao had a look of disbelief on his face. This kind of expression turned into admiration and then into pity when Miao sighed and said, "You're actually willing to enter the higher space-time dimensions like this. Don't you know that entering the higher space-time dimensions isn't all smooth sailing and wonderful?" The 8 of them smiled bitterly, and one of them said, "In any level of the world, nothing was absolutely wonderful. It was the same for the other side. How can we not know this? If you know, why do you still pay so much to enter the higher space-time dimensions?" When Miao asked curiously, this made the faces of the 8 twitch. In the end, it was still that person who said, "Because only by entering the other side can one be qualified to pursue transcendence. Only then can one obtain true eternity." When Miao recalled what Luo Fan had told her about the true essence of cultivation, she was silent for a while. "Master, please take us in." The 8 looked at Wen Miao's expression and immediately bowed. She said, hearing this, Wen Miao sighed and turned to look at Luo Fan. Luo Fan only smiled and said, "You decide how many people to bring in. You decide how many people to bring in. All right, then follow me. However, although you're already mentally prepared, I still have to say that the higher space-time dimensions might be worse than you think," Wen Miao said. Hearing this, the 8 people's faces were filled with joy. They couldn't help but thank Meow. However, they didn't take Meow's words to heart. Since they had already agreed to be her followers, they were also slaves. Naturally, they didn't need to be as far away as before. At that moment, the 8 people stepped forward. Using the power of the space-time dimensions, they directly came to Meow's side. They bowed again to confirm their master-servant relationship and stood behind her obediently. Are you going to stay in this space-time dimension for a while, or are you going to start preparing to break through that door? Luo Fan asked Meow. The higher space-time dimensions were Meow's home. This time, the reason for coming here was to send Meow home. Therefore, it was reasonable for him to ask Meow. Behind that door should be the higher space-time dimensions, right? Meow asked. Luo Fan nodded and said, "That's right. This is the result of the obsession of countless living beings in this world for countless years. No matter what the connection between the space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimensions is, no matter how different the space-time dimensions are between the two, everything has already condensed into this door. As long as we push open this door, we will be able to step into your home." Hearing this, Meow had an inexplicable timid look on her face, as if she was faintly feeling homesick. After a while, Meow actually said, "I think it's better to stay in this space-time dimension for a while first." These words caused the eyes of the 8 people behind her to be filled with anxiety. However, after all, their identities had already been confirmed, so they did not dare to voice any different opinions. Each and every one of them just stood there obediently, waiting for Luo Fan's decision. Naturally, Luo Fan didn't care. He didn't have any overly important goals in entering the higher space-time dimensions. He just wanted to increase his knowledge and accumulate resources for the growth of his worldview. With this goal in mind, there wasn't much difference between this space-time dimension and the higher space-time dimension. Immediately, he said, "As you wish." As he said that, he stopped what he was doing and prepared to break through the abstract door at any time. Following this change, there was an inexplicable sense of disappointment in the space-time dimension. It engulfed Luo Fan's mind and faintly urged him to quickly break through the door. It has actually grown to this stage. This is already comparable to the perfect world. Luo Fan felt this inexplicable urging, and such a thought flashed in his mind. This urging came from the will of the heavens and earth. He didn't know where this world came from, but after countless years and the obsession of countless living beings, its essence had unknowingly changed. Now, it wholeheartedly wanted to open the door to the immortal dimension, which was the higher space-time dimension. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan was clearly able to open the portal, but he stopped at the last moment. This situation was naturally not satisfactory for him. However, this urging, it was obviously useless for Luo Fan. He just carefully felt this urging, but his body didn't move at all. After a while, only then did the urging gradually disappear. "Okay, let's go." Luo Fan smiled. Previously, in order to feel this urging, he didn't move at all. Therefore, the crowd stayed here for a long time. "What happened just now? Did you feel something wrong?" The Air Maiden asked. "Nothing, it's just that the will of the heavens and earth here is urging me." Luo Fan just smiled. "Then, will there be a problem?" This time, it wasn't the Air Maiden who asked this question, but Meow. After all, she was the one who made the decision to stay here, not Luo Fan. Because of this decision, Luo Fan was noticed by the will of the heavens and earth here, and it even urged him. She naturally had to bear some responsibility. At this moment, although the expressions of the 8 people behind her didn't change, their eyes were filled with anticipation. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Of course there won't be a problem. Even you can fight with the will of the heavens and earth. How can I not?" Hearing this, Meow heaved a sigh of relief. Luo Fan was stronger than her. In the past, before she met Luo Fan, she definitely wouldn't have believed it. However, ever since Luo Fan had sealed his abilities, he had not been able to do so. Coupled with the various encounters she had on the path of transcendence over the years, she was already extremely convinced of Luo Fan and admitted the fact that Luo Fan was many times stronger than her. At this moment, the eyes of the 8 people behind her were filled with disappointment. Evidently, they were somewhat disappointed that Luo Fan was able to resist the will of the heavens and earth and not open the door to leave. However, their thoughts weren't enough to influence the thoughts of Luo Fan and the other two. At this moment, Luo Fan asked, "What's the most amazing thing about this space-time dimension?" Hearing this, the person who had spoken earlier said, "There are 36 forbidden areas in this space-time dimension. Even we don't dare to enter." It's said that there are many senior experts living in seclusion. I don't know if it's true or not. If there's a place that's the most wondrous, then it should be within these 36 forbidden areas. Luo Fan couldn't help but reveal a glint of interest in his eyes. "Even you guys don't dare to enter. It seems that those forbidden areas are quite mysterious," he muttered. At this moment, he said to a meow, an air maiden, "Why don't we go and take a look?" For any world and any space-time dimension, the most obvious and intuitive place to display its special characteristics was the space-time dimension, or the most dangerous place in the world. This was because all the special characteristics of the world would be displayed most vividly in such a place. Those forbidden areas were obviously such places. Although Meow and Air Maiden were in a weaker position in front of Luo Fan, there was no doubt that they were powerful. Naturally, they were not the kind of people who were afraid of trouble. In the face of Luo Fan's proposal, they nodded indifferently. Luo Fan then said to the 8 people, "Let's start with the safest forbidden area." Hearing this, the 8 people hurriedly nodded. Every one of the 36 forbidden areas was extremely dangerous, but it was naturally impossible for all of them to be of the same level. There were bound to be some forbidden areas that were more terrifying, while others that were less dangerous. There was no need to say anything about this point. Half a day later, Luo Fan and the others stood at the bottom of an abyss and felt the endless changes in the space-time dimension around them. In a trance, they seemed to be jumping between many space-time dimensions at all times, and the various terrifying powers were almost enough to tear apart any level 3 Supreme Emperor. As expected of a forbidden area, it's indeed quite dangerous. An inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he sensed the various things around him. The changes in the surrounding space-time dimension were extremely subtle, but their source was a manifestation of the interaction between a higher and lower space-time dimension. After experiencing this for a short period of time, he felt that he had a deeper understanding of the nature of the space-time dimension, and he felt that his control over the power of the space-time dimension had improved a little. At this moment, only Luo Fan, Meow, and Air Maiden appeared in the depths of this abyss. The other 8 followers that Meow had just accepted were outside the abyss and had not stepped into it at all. To them, the dangers of this forbidden area were already ingrained in their instincts. Even if they were perversely obsessed with going to a higher space-time dimension, they were still unwilling to step into this forbidden area. This place is actually considered another space-time dimension. Meow sensed the surroundings, and her face turned slightly pale. She had an extremely deep understanding of the space-time dimension, and she clearly knew that the terrifying changes in the space-time dimension around her were enough to annihilate her. If she had not been protected by Luo Fan, she would definitely not have been able to stand here so easily. Although this was an abyss, they could not see the place where they had come from when they looked up from here. Above them, there were also extremely terrifying changes in the space-time dimension. Roar. At this moment, a roar came from afar. This sound was extremely soft, but it contained all sorts of incredible and terrifying changes in the space-time dimension. The surrounding space-time dimension changed even more intensely and terrifyingly because of this roar. Chapter 1836. At this moment, the surrounding space-time dimension faintly underwent all sorts of strange changes. Amidst these changes, creatures that were also constructed from the space-time dimension, but were extremely bizarre, as if the space-time dimension had been completely transformed into muscles and bones, strands and strands of them. These creatures were like fish in the ocean in the space-time dimension, and they gradually appeared around them. The appearance of these creatures was completely different from that of ordinary creatures made of flesh and blood. Their bodies did not have a fixed shape. At least, to the naked eye, they did not have any fixed shape at all. These living beings were constantly squirming in the space-time dimension. They were constantly changing like clouds like the wind. The roar had come from one of these creatures. After they appeared, they slowly revolved around Luo Fan and the other two in the space-time dimension. All of them exuded an indescribable greed and bloodlust. Even though they did not have eyes and did not show any expression, Luo Fan and the other two knew very well what these creatures wanted. So powerful. At this moment, Miao was shocked. She felt that this kind of creature was extremely horrifying. Even though she had obtained a huge breakthrough and was already fundamentally different from before, she still felt powerless when faced with such creatures and discovered such terrifying existences. An indescribable sense of crisis kept surfacing in her heart, assaulting her rationality and mind. Under such circumstances, even ordinary creatures could tell that they were facing an existence that was much stronger than them, let alone Miao, who was billions of times stronger than ordinary creatures. Suddenly, among the densely packed creatures, one of them could not suppress the greed in its heart. It roared and pounced towards the three of them. During this process, the place where the three of them were standing suddenly underwent an extremely terrifying change. The space-time dimension seemed to have suddenly turned into a rope and began to wrap around the three of them, wanting to completely entangle them. They could not move at all. This sudden change instantly disintegrated all of Miao's and Space Maiden's strength. This was not because the change was so powerful that they could not resist it. Rather, it was because the change was too sudden, so sudden that they could not react at all. It was impossible to make an effective response. If they were given some time, they would be able to carefully observe and deal with it. This kind of change would definitely not cause them any trouble. However, it was clear that such a scenario did not happen. At this moment, the creature was already right in front of them, but they no longer had the time to think, to experience it, to deal with the sudden change in the surrounding space-time dimension. At this moment, they could only instinctively unleash their power, to attack, to resist the terrifying power of this terrifying creature in front of him. However, although this kind of power was enough to destroy heaven and earth, it was on a completely different level compared to that creature's attack. This kind of attack ultimately fell through the air. Without any hindrance, the creature had already arrived in front of them and was about to tear apart the natural space-time dimension in their bodies. At this moment, Luo Fan made his move. He didn't seem to have done anything, but his hand had already reached into the creature's body. With a slight twist, he had already grabbed a ball of light. As the ball of light was grabbed, the body of the strange creature constructed by the space-time dimension trembled and suddenly collapsed, turning into countless fragmented space-time dimensions that began to converge into the surrounding abyss, disappearing without a trace and could no longer be found. At this moment, terrifying roars came from the surroundings. These roars were filled with fear, ferocity, and brutality. Immediately after, creatures began to pounce on Luo Fan and the others. Under their ferocious pounce, the space-time dimension seemed to be strangled. In the blink of an eye, it became unprecedentedly terrifying and chaotic. Amidst this terror and chaos, there was no need to wait for the attacks of these creatures. Any living being that stepped into the void dimension would definitely not be able to withstand it. They would definitely collapse and be completely destroyed under the chaos, eventually dying a violent death. This was also the reason why the abyss was a forbidden zone. At this moment, Space Maiden and Miao were performing much better than the creatures in the space-time dimension. At the very least, they would not die in this chaos. However, this was only temporary. They were trying their best to analyze the changes in their surroundings and try their best to understand the nature of the changes in the space-time dimension. However, this still took time. Time was the most luxurious existence at this moment. With so many creatures eyeing them covetously, what they lacked was time. From this, it could be predicted that if they were the only ones here, what awaited them would definitely be death and their souls would scatter. It would not even be possible for them to integrate into the surrounding space-time dimension. However, It was clear that Luo Fan was here, and not the two of them were alone. Although this was the first time Luo Fan had seen such a chaotic scene, it was also the first time he had seen the composition of a completely different space-time dimension. However, his own realm was already extremely high, and he had even stepped onto the path to become a true sage. His sensing ability, deduction ability, and analysis ability were all very strong. There was almost no need for time. After seeing the various changes in front of him for a millionth of an instant, he had already understood the nature of everything. In an instant, he was able to control this chaos and the space-time dimension behind it. Hence, at this moment, he grabbed and pulled. His palm seemed to have transformed into countless clones and directly appeared in the bodies of every living creature around him. With a grab, he grabbed a ball of light that existed within them. As soon as he pulled that ball of light, those living creatures collapsed and died one after another. As these living creatures collapsed and died, although the various changes in the surroundings did not calm down immediately, they did not worsen either. This also gave Space Maiden and Wamiao a chance to understand the chaos around them and the composition of the space-time dimension in the depths of the abyss. After a long while, Wamiao and Space Maiden let out a long breath of relief. They either lifted their hands gently or opened their mouths to reprimand. In the blink of an eye, the chaos around them had been completely smoothed out. The surrounding dimensional space returned to its original state. Although this state was still extremely horrifying and inexplicable, and most living beings of this dimensional space could not bear it, it was much better than before. What a strange forbidden area. Wamiao finally let out such a sigh. At this time, in front of Luo Fan, there were already several balls of light floating in the air. Among these balls of light, there was an inexplicable wool faintly seeping out like living creatures. Faintly, Wamiao and Space Maiden seemed to sense some familiar aura and smell from those balls of light. It was obvious. This was the aura and smell of those living creatures. At this moment, Luo Fan was like an extremely mad scientist who was grabbing the balls of light to dissect them. He was analyzing them. There was a hint of irony in the scene. After a long while, Luo Fan let out a long breath and said, "These aren't the strongest living creatures, but they aren't the weakest either. There must be even more powerful living creatures in the deeper parts." As he said that, he casually waved his hand, and those balls of light collapsed and were destroyed one by one. In the blink of an eye, they completely turned into wisps of the space-time dimension's power and merged into the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. Those balls of light were none other than the cores of those living creatures. They were also equivalent to the life source of a living creature like Luo Fan. Once these cores were plucked, it was equivalent to all the essence of that living creature being had been plucked. Naturally, its body would lose its vitality. And because it was a construct of the space-time dimension, it would naturally collapse, completely disintegrate, and disappear without a trace. And these cores contained all the essence of those living creatures. As long as one analyzed and understood them, one would naturally be able to obtain all the information and secrets of those living creatures. That was why Luo Fan had done so many things previously. It's still not the strongest. Wamiao was shocked. This kind of existence could definitely occupy a part of the world and become an overlord even in the higher space-time dimension, but it was actually not the strongest. Wasn't this forbidden zone even more terrifying than the higher space-time dimension? And this was only the least dangerous forbidden zone among the 36 forbidden zones, but it was already like this. Wouldn't the other forbidden zones be even more terrifying? They should only differentiate between the forbidden zones because of these living creatures. In fact, it might not be because of these living creatures, but because of the environment in the abyss. It shouldn't be as terrifying as you think it is. The air hostess already knew Wamiao very well. She naturally knew what Wamiao was thinking just by looking at her expression, so she comforted her with a smile. Although it was just a form of comfort, it didn't mean that it wasn't the truth. In fact, it was extremely likely to be the truth. After all, not everyone could be like Luo Fan, who could see through the various essences of the creatures around him, and who could see through these essences to see more secrets behind them. For the living creatures in the higher space-time dimension, it was very likely that they would die once they stepped into this place. Even if they could withstand the environment here and the drastic changes in the space-time dimension, they definitely wouldn't be able to withstand the first wave of attacks from the living creatures. If that was the case, how could they know what was behind these living creatures? How could they know that there was an even more powerful and profound secret behind it? Hearing this, Meow was taken aback. Then she laughed and said, "That's right, I almost went into a dead end. So what do we do now? Go back." After laughing, she turned to look at Luo Fan. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "How can we go back just like this? We've only seen the tip of the iceberg of this forbidden zone, right?" Immediately, he took the lead and stepped forward. The surrounding space-time dimension naturally condensed and combined the moment he stepped out. It turned into a path that led to the endless depths of darkness. This path formed by the space-time dimension was pitch black. If an ordinary living creature or even an ordinary cultivator came here, they definitely wouldn't be able to see the difference between this path and the path. However, Luo Fan and Meow, who used the space-time dimension as their perspective, could see at a glance that their surroundings had become brighter because of the appearance of the space-time dimension. Gradually, the darkness of the abyss was dispelled, and the surrounding scenery was gradually revealed. Around them was a boundless, strange space-time dimension. Here, countless fragments of the space-time dimension were combined in an extremely strange way. They turned into an incomparably stable and powerful space-time dimension. Although this place was different from the lowest space-time dimension, the deepest space-time dimension that Luo Fan and the others stepped into through the dimensional gate was also formed by the combination of countless fragments of the space-time dimension. But there was a world of difference between the two. If compared to real matter, the lowest space-time dimension was like graphite. Here, it was like a diamond. Graphite and diamond were both made of carbon atoms. However, the difference in hardness between the two was like the difference between heaven and earth. Just like this moment, these two space-time dimensions were formed by countless space-time dimensional fragments. However, the gap between them was still as wide as the sky and the earth. Even with Meow's abilities, it was impossible for him to truly destroy the combination of the space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings. However, it was still extremely difficult, and one might even need to expend an endless amount of energy just to be able to accomplish a little. The surrounding living beings. There were more and more of them as they moved forward. However, perhaps it was because of the murderous aura emanating from Luo Fan's body that caused the surrounding space-time dimensions to tremble. None of the living beings dared to approach. This allowed the three of them to easily step into the depths of this space-time dimension and truly witness the true origin of this space-time dimension. This is not natural. Meow couldn't help but exclaim when she saw the source. At this moment, she had a shocked expression on her face. His eyes were filled with disbelief. This was because at this very moment, the core of the space-time dimension in front of the three of them was a formation. It was a formation constructed by an unknown number of space-time dimensional fragments. It was so exquisite that just one look at it was enough to make her feel greatly touched and enlightened. This formation occupied almost half of the space-time dimension in the depths of the space-time dimension. The space-time dimensional fragments that formed this formation were densely packed, and their number was close to infinite. The flow and changes of the space-time dimension seemed to be all-inclusive. Not to mention Meow. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel indescribably shocked when he saw it. This is not the method of a true sage. In an instant, he made his first judgment. Then, he made another judgment. The person who constructed this formation must have a deep understanding of the space-time dimension. With these two deductions, the result was already obvious. The existence who constructed this formation must be an overlord of the higher space-time dimension. Buzz, 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 buzz. Suddenly, as if their arrival had stirred up some sort of change, a strange sound came from the entire formation. Amidst this sound, a powerful aura was emitted from the formation. Then, one after another, Creatures rushed out of the array like flowing water, like waves crashing against reefs. They fiercely charged towards Luo, Fan, and the others. Most of these living creatures were as strong as the space-time dimensional living creatures that Luo Fan had killed before. However, among every few dozen living creatures, there was one that was far stronger than those living creatures. This made Luo Fan feel an inexplicable sense of danger. "I'll leave the rest to you," Luo Fan said. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure crashed into the group of living creatures. He targeted the powerful living creatures that were stronger than the other living creatures and directly launched an attack. He had already studied the cores of those living creatures and had already deduced the existence of such powerful living creatures. Therefore, he naturally knew the weaknesses of these living creatures. At this moment, although the powerful living creatures were unleashing their full power, which was enough to make him feel threatened, he still easily bypassed their defenses and withstood their attacks. He directly plucked the cores of the living creatures, as though he was plucking grapes. Following his actions, there were hundreds of sun-like light spheres in front of him in a short while. The powerful living creatures had already collapsed and turned into space-time dimensions before returning to the formation. At the same time, Air Maiden and Meow, who were at the back, also had results. At this moment, the countless living beings had already been completely dealt with by them. All of them had collapsed and perished. Only the light spheres in their hands could compare to the light spheres in front of Luo Fan. "Still not coming out?" Luo Fan said faintly. This voice was supported by the space-time dimension. In the blink of an eye, it spread throughout the entire space-time dimension. It even directly passed through the abyss and spread far into the space-time dimension. The entire space-time dimension could vaguely hear this voice. At this moment, the 8 living creatures that were waiting for Luo Fan's group at the entrance of the abyss were all shocked. The existence of this voice made them truly feel how powerful Luo Fan was. They truly understood how insignificant they were in front of Luo Fan. Chapter 1837. Luo Fan and the others naturally did not care about the reactions of the living beings above. At this moment, Air Maiden and Meow were constantly observing the surroundings with bewildered expressions. From Luo Fan's words, it was clear that there were living beings hiding in the surroundings. However, with their observation and sensing abilities, they were completely unable to determine whether or not it existed, much less where it was. Of course, they did not doubt that Luo Fan was speaking without thinking. This was a kind of trust that came from countless years of traveling together. There was no movement in the surroundings. It was as if no one was hiding behind him, and Luo Fan was just being paranoid. "Still not coming out? Do you really think I won't be able to discover you?" Luo Fan frowned. As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed at the array in front of him. The power of countless space-time dimensions surged endlessly, producing an incomparably terrifying might. It suddenly rushed into the array, causing it to shake violently. Amidst this vibration, the space-time dimension was like a leaf on a turbulent sea, becoming extremely chaotic. Endless lights and shadows began to appear and collapse above the formation, creating all kinds of incredible scenes. In the end, at a certain moment in time, a light sound resounded out that suppressed all other movements, and it was instantly transmitted into the ears of Luo Fan, Sky Maiden, and Meow, who were here at this moment. "So it's there." At this moment, the same thought appeared in the minds of Air Maiden and Meow at the same time. Their gazes were fixed on the sky above the formation. At the very least, they knew that it was an extremely calm spot in the sky. In that position, the chaos of the space-time dimension was completely suppressed. It was like the only lighthouse in the raging sea, illuminating its surroundings. From the perspective of the space-time dimension, it was extremely eye-catching. It was the outline of a human figure. However, this silhouette, in terms of size, it was at least 10,000 times larger than the average living being and the average Khanate Dao constitution. It was a 10,000 zhang tall giant. At this moment, the giant was lying on its side in the void, facing Luo Fan and the others. Just now, the giant seemed to be in a deep slumber. At this time, it was attacked by the power of the infinite space-time dimensions around it, and it slowly opened its eyes. There was an indescribable majesty in his eyes that shrouded Luo Fan and the others who lived here. This figure was a middle-aged man. The structure of his body was also constructed from the materialization of the space-time dimension. This kind of structure was fundamentally different from the structure of the many living beings born from the formation in this abyss. In comparison, it was more like a wondrous way of constructing a body. However, this construction method was much more profound and complex than Meow's. The complete space-time dimension that was constructed was much vaster. It was grander and more complicated. One look was enough to tell. The person in front of them was a being from a higher space-time dimension. Furthermore, his cultivation was many times stronger than Meow's. The giant slowly sat up, shook his head, and sighed. His body naturally shrank as he moved. By the time he sat up completely, his body had already shrunk to a normal size. Of course, this normal size was based on the size of Luo Fan, Meow, and Kong Nu at this time. Perhaps, based on the size of the giant, he had already shrunk to a strange state. After he had shrunk to this extent, he slowly stood up and took a step forward. The space-time dimensional fragments seemed to turn into stone slabs that appeared under his feet. They took him directly to the void not far from Luo Fan. He looked down at Luo Fan and the others from a higher position. I didn't expect that someone would be able to discover me. It seems like you came from a higher space-time dimension. How rare. The person glanced at Luo Fan and the others and said faintly. Luo Fan looked at him and frowned. He didn't say anything and grabbed him. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable power poured into the space-time dimension, directly wrapping it up. As the space-time dimension trembled, it completely disintegrated the middle-aged man's ability to resist. It instantly wrapped him up, turning him into a formless dumpling. With a pull, he was thrown onto the space-time dimension fragment in front of the three of them. Rumble, with a loud sound, the middle-aged man's body, which was the foundation of the space-time dimension, shook and collapsed. Then, he was wrapped up by the space-time dimension that carried Luo Fan's power and restored to a complete state. However, compared to before, he looked dispirited and pale. "Can you talk properly now?" Luo Fan asked faintly. At this time, the middle-aged man, who had been completely dumbfounded by Luo Fan's decisive action and didn't know how to react, finally reacted. His face suddenly turned red, and his eyes were filled with indescribable anger. "You deserve to die." A loud roar erupted from his mouth. At this moment, the surrounding space-time dimension shattered bit by bit. Countless space-time dimensional fragments surged and formed an extremely strange light and shadow that couldn't be described with words. It was as if this place had suddenly returned to a chaotic state. Just this roar alone had already created such a terrifying scene. One could imagine how powerful this creature was. However, with a wave of Luo Fan's hand, these changes were completely limited to the several space-time dimensions around the middle-aged man's body. They couldn't even get close to the three of them, let alone cause any real damage. At this time, the middle-aged man's rationality had been broken by anger. He roared, and the power of the space-time dimension in his body crazily attacked. All kinds of strange powers erupted under the impact and constantly stirred up the surroundings, attacking Luo Fan's power and destroying the surrounding space-time dimensions. He wanted to break all the shackles and attack Luo Fan. What a wonderful way to use it. At this time, Luo Fan's eyes lit up and this thought flashed in his mind. The middle-aged man's manipulation of the space-time dimension was 100 times more exquisite than Meow's. The power of the space-time dimension that he controlled. He was more than 10,000 times stronger than Meow. At this time, if it wasn't for Luo Fan's endless power, he would have absorbed nourishment from the other party's movements to improve his own methods and power. At the same time, they were constantly absorbing nourishment from their opponent's movements, improving their own methods, and improving the execution of their own power. Perhaps their opponent's resistance had already broken through all their shackles and hurt them. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan couldn't help but admire him. At this time, Luo Fan wasn't the only one who felt that he had gained a lot. Miao and Air Maiden also felt the same. Their eyes were shining as they constantly absorbed all kinds of nourishment that could improve their strength. They felt that their understanding of the space-time dimension and their ability to control the power of the space-time dimension were constantly strengthened. Among them, Miao's improvement was the most obvious. After all, she was also a creature of a higher space-time dimension. She wasn't much different from the middle-aged man in front of her. As long as she learned all of the middle-aged man's manipulation methods, she could immediately use them and transform them into her own strength. Under such circumstances, her gains were huge, but it was only natural. However, Miao's improvement was obvious. Air Maiden's improvement was not much different. Air Maiden wasn't a creature of a higher space-time dimension. Although she could control some of the power of the space-time dimension and use some of the power of creatures of a higher space-time dimension. However, every use required a transformation that was many times more complicated than that of creatures of a higher space-time dimension. She needed a technique that was many times better than theirs to make up for the gap between races. Hence, although she could convert the means displayed by the middle-aged man and the exquisite manipulation of the space-time dimension into power, she still needed a lot of time to digest it before she could sit down. However, don't forget what Air Maiden's most important task was now. Her most important task: to establish her own unique space-time dimension. He had truly found his own space-time dimension. To be able to be independent in the space-time dimension and not be affected by any space-time dimension in the outside world. This task was a task that involved almost all of her cultivation before she became a true sage. In other words, it was a cultivation task that had almost no end. Under such circumstances, displaying the profound principles and mysterious mysteries of the space-time dimension in front of her was simply like teaching her how to find her own space-time dimension step by step. It was self-evident how beneficial it would be to her. Suddenly, at a certain moment, Air Maiden's body suddenly emitted an extremely wonderful sound. This sound was like a song, like a hymn, like a sob, like a celestial voice, like a Sanskrit song. It had an indescribable beauty. At that moment, Air Maiden's body seemed to suddenly become extremely blurry, but it also seemed to suddenly become extremely clear. Faintly, there was an unprecedented, unique charm that was conveyed. Under this charm, the space-time dimension fragments around her body were continuously scattered and reformed. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a circle of faintly discernible space-time dimension. Even with Miao's perspective of the higher space-time dimension, it was difficult to see clearly. This space-time dimension had an extremely deep imprint that belonged to Air Maiden. It was also the existence of this imprint that made Miao unable to understand or even see the space-time dimension around her body clearly. This is a space-time dimension that belongs to her. At that moment, this thought flashed through Miao's mind. The moment this thought appeared in her mind, she did not feel anything. After all, for a being of the higher space-time dimension, the existence of the space-time dimension was equivalent to the existence of soil and power. Would one feel anything when a person suddenly had some soil that belonged to them? However, she quickly came to her senses. Her face was suddenly filled with shock. This is a space-time dimension that belongs to her. How is this possible? Could it be that she is going to become a true saint? This thought instantly replaced her previous indifferent thoughts, causing her face to become extremely shocked. It was just like soil. You had some soil attached to your body, and it belonged to you. It was a completely different concept from having it on the ground, and it belonged to you. Based on her previous understanding, the space-time dimension belonged to Air Maiden, and it was equivalent to soil attached to her body. It would only make her dirty, and it would not be of any other use. However, she only thought about it now. How is that soil attached to her body? That was clearly dividing up a piece of land and taking it for himself. This was the difference between the two. It was like the difference between the sky and the earth, forming a space-time dimension that belongs to her. Then, all the space-time dimensions in the outside world would not be able to invade or affect her. From then on, all the forces of the higher space-time dimension would be of no threat to her. That would be truly eternal and indestructible. The thought of the benefits of obtaining a space-time dimension that belonged to her flashed through her mind. When Meow's expression became even more shocked. This was the fundamental reason why an existence like a true saint could ignore the existence of the higher space-time dimension. The fundamental reason why the beings of the higher space-time dimension and the experts of the higher space-time dimension were so respectful and fearful of the true saint, to the extent that they would rather ignore them, was also because of this. No, she still has a long way to go. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and said, these words made Meow heave a sigh of relief. However, very quickly, she became anxious again. She did not say these words out loud. So how did Luo Fan know? The fluctuation of your thoughts just now was really too intense. It was as if it was constantly roaring in my heart. Even if I wanted to not feel it, I couldn't do it. Luo Fan just smiled and said, this was the truth. At that moment, Meow was incomparably shocked by the changes that happened to the air hostess. The fluctuation of her emotions and mind was incomparably intense, but it directly penetrated out of her body and spread in all directions. However, it was naturally transmitted into Luo Fan's senses. Thus, he knew what she was thinking. After saying this clearly, Meow heaved a sigh of relief. Then, she became curious about what Luo Fan had said. Why is there still a long way to go? I think you have already succeeded, right? That's right. I really have a long way to go. Now, I have just barely succeeded in condensing it, although I am much stronger than before. However, there's still a world of difference between me and the true saint level. Let's not talk about anything else. Right now, I might not even be able to ignore your attacks. The air hostess had already recovered at this moment and sighed. At this moment, the extremely mysterious layer of space-time dimension around her body was still not withdrawn. It was still producing countless changes at every moment, and it was always in harmony with her physical and mental state, as well as all of her origins. Under such circumstances, if she was in a normal world, it was almost impossible for any living being to discover her apart from Luo Fan. It was impossible for normal living beings to transcend the space-time dimension to see things. Their vision and perception would all be blocked by the space-time dimension. However, here, in this special space-time dimension, in front of Meow, this state would not be a problem at all. Meow could still clearly see her existence. After all, she was a living being of a higher space-time dimension, and her own space-time dimension was just an ordinary power in her eyes. It was really very simple for her to see through power to see things that were blocked by power. At this moment, Meow looked at the air hostess with a somewhat defeated expression. In the end, you still left me far behind. She sighed. You've gone too far. At this moment, an angry roar came from the chaotic space-time dimension in front of them. This was the loud roar of the middle-aged man. As this roar sounded, a power that was 10,000 times more terrifying than before erupted from the middle-aged man's body, and it instantly broke through the power that Luo Fan had restrained him. The terrifying chaos instantly surged towards them, and it seemed like it was about to completely drown them. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He pulled the air hostess and Meow with him and flashed. They had already used the connection between the space-time dimension to disappear from where they were in a single leap, and they dodged far away, causing the chaotic waves to hit nothing but air. At this moment, the huge formation began to churn, and countless cracks and fragments appeared on the formation. As the formation began to malfunction, the entire space-time dimension began to shake violently. The space-time dimension fragments, which had originally been extremely sturdy and stable, began to show signs of instability. He actually used the explosive power of the formation to escape. He really has some ideas. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he raised his hand to grab the void in front of him. An extremely pure power instantly appeared in front of him out of nowhere, forming a huge palm that reached out towards the chaotic waves. "Come out," he said at this moment. As he said this, the palm formed by pure power seemed to have grabbed onto something, and there was a faint sound of an intense struggle. The vibrations of the entire space-time dimension became increasingly intense, and the cracks and fragments on the formation increased as a result. It became even more shocking and terrifying. Rumble, an earth-shattering explosion reverberated throughout the space-time dimension. The formation also suddenly collapsed during this process, turning into countless space-time dimensional fragments that surged in all directions, stirring up the entire space-time dimension and causing shocking chaos. An unknown number of terrifying creatures were born as a result. All of these creatures were formed from the space-time dimension. However, compared to the creatures whose cores had been extracted by Luo Fan and the others, these creatures were extremely terrifying, but they were also extremely weak. They were so terrifying that even Luo Fan felt a great threat, as if he could be crushed to death with a single claw. However, the weak creatures couldn't even survive in the turbulence of the space-time dimension. They were completely destroyed the moment they were born, and they became a part of the chaotic turbulence. Chapter 1838. He actually managed to escape? Wen Miao's face was filled with shock. She had long been convinced of Luo Fan's strength and felt that he was omnipotent. All along, Luo Fan's performance had been that nothing could stump him and that he could deal with everything with one hand. Under such circumstances, the man from before was actually able to break free from his control and escape. This made her inexplicably shocked. Of course, this shock wasn't directed at Luo Fan. It wasn't because she thought that Luo Fan was weaker than she had imagined. Instead, she was shocked by the man and his strength. He was so strong that he could actually escape from Luo Fan's grasp. "He can't escape," Luo Fan said. However, he didn't make any movements and only quietly hovered there, watching the intense changes in the abyss below. At this moment, the entire space-time dimension was violently shaking. Vaguely, the abstract door in the void seemed to be shaking as well, as if it could collapse at any time and open at any time. Such a change naturally shocked the countless life forms in the space-time dimension. For a time, who knew how many living beings came out from their respective secluded cultivation grounds and hovered in the void as they looked around, searching for the source of these changes, which was where Luo Fan and the others were. Even the other 35 restricted areas were faintly changing, as if there were living beings coming out to observe the surroundings. After all, the changes in this restricted area were unimaginable. Furthermore, Luo Fan didn't hide it. As a result, the changes in this area didn't escape the senses of others. Very soon, who knew how many living beings clearly sensed the source of the changes. How can this be? This was what the 8 living beings who had joined Wen Miao as followers were thinking. To them, the entire process of the restricted area's changes was witnessed by them. They were extremely clear about the source of all these changes. It was precisely because they were clear. Therefore, the shock they felt was even greater and more terrifying. At this moment, their souls had been completely shaken, and all their thoughts had been completely suppressed. At this moment, all his thoughts had already turned into obedience. He no longer dared to have any strange thoughts. After the shock in their hearts had passed, they became unprecedentedly obedient, doing their best to stay by Wen Miao's side, helping her resist the various changes that would not have caused any trouble to Wen Miao. At this moment, Wen Miao only glanced at them before turning his gaze back to the shattering space-time dimension in the abyss. With her eyesight, she could clearly see many things that the living beings of this dimension couldn't see through. The entire process of the space-time dimension shattering. It was the terror of the destruction of heaven and earth, the sorrow of the death of everything. Wen Miao's heart was filled with an indescribable sense of shock. She simulated it a little. She knew that once she stepped into it, it would be impossible for her to resist the changes within, and it would be impossible for her to let the shattering that was happening at this moment leave her. It was precisely because of this that she was very skeptical about the man's ability to leave this shattered space-time dimension. She even had an inexplicable thought that the middle-aged man in front of her should have gone overboard. Perhaps he had originally wanted to rely on this to attack Luo Fan's power and escape, leave this space-time dimension and obtain true safety. However, he should have underestimated this change. He had wrongly estimated his own strength. Perhaps he was already dead, and his soul had already dispersed into nothingness, just as everyone was having all sorts of inexplicable thoughts in their minds. Gazes from all directions turned towards them. This kind of gaze was naturally invisible to ordinary living beings, and it could not even be sensed. However, to existences like Luo Fan and the others, it was like a pillar that could not be any more obvious. At this moment, Luo Fan did not take any action. Miao furrowed her brows and snorted softly. Following this snort, the surrounding space-time dimension naturally produced a strange fluctuation. This fluctuation was like a ripple that began to spread in all directions with her as the center. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept across the surrounding gazes. In an instant, the surrounding gazes collapsed bit by bit. At this moment, muffled groans could be heard from all directions in this space-time dimension. Countless living beings directly vomited blood, and some even went berserk, causing their bodies to collapse. They simply could not withstand the power of Miao's manipulation of the space-time dimension, and they were directly injured by this power. However, this was not all. There were also a small number of living beings who were not injured because of this. However, even they were only able to ensure that they were not injured. They wanted to continue looking around, but they did not dare to do so anymore. It's finally quiet. Miao's expression finally relaxed a little. If it was any other time, she would naturally not care about being watched by so many gazes. However, this was clearly a gaze that was trying to pry into her and the others' true identities. This feeling of probing was simply as if a palm was continuously caressing her body. This was simply a great humiliation. How could she be willing to do so? Regarding all these changes, Luo Fan naturally did not pay attention to them. At this moment, he looked at the ongoing changes in the abyss. After a while, he seemed to have discovered something. His heart moved, and he casually reached out to grab it. A strange power gushed out from his hand, turning into a palm in the void, and suddenly reached into the unpredictable, chaotic space-time dimension. With a slight grab and a pull, a figure had already been caught in front of him, and he threw it into the space-time dimension. The space-time dimension seemed to have turned into the hardest material, and a crackling sound was heard. Along with this sound, the figure's body seemed to have been directly smashed apart, and it suddenly turned into a ball of strange light and shadow. After a while, it condensed again and turned into the figure of a middle-aged man. However, at this moment, where did this middle-aged man still have the majesty and power from before? There was. However, he was only pale and in a sorry state. Lying in the space-time dimension, he was simply like a terminally ill patient waiting for death. How was this a world of difference from before? How did you discover me? The middle-aged man stared at Luo Fan, his eyes full of disbelief. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Is it difficult to discover you? Although you self-destructed the entire formation and completely destroyed the space-time dimension. However, this kind of chaos is ultimately chaos. But in essence, not much has changed for me. For me, there is not much difference." Impossible. How can there be no difference? Even a true supreme cannot ignore this chaos. How did you discover me in this kind of chaos? The middle-aged man still did not believe in Luo Fan's strength and shouted loudly. The supreme of the higher space-time dimension was the strongest existence in the higher space-time dimension. Compared to a true saint, there was only a slight difference. It could even be said that their status in the higher space-time dimension was similar to that of a true saint. This was something that Luo Fan was very clear about after communicating with Miao all these years. Perhaps your supreme can't do it. However, even I can do it now. How can he not do it? At this moment, the air hostess sighed. At this moment, There was an indescribable aura lingering around her body. It was as if she had already transcended the world, the space-time dimension, and the entire universe. In her eyes, there was an unknown number of mysterious lights and shadows, which contained an unknown number of indescribable mysteries. It was precisely because of these lights and shadows and mysteries that she could see everything so clearly and directly. The absolute chaos in the space-time dimension fragment in the abyss in front of her. To her, it was even clearer than in Meow's eyes. Therefore, that was why she said such words. If Luo Fan said so, the middle-aged man obviously would not believe it. But now, even the air hostess said so. For a moment, he felt a little at a loss. He wanted to believe it, but found that his reason was so weak. He wanted to believe it, but could not get past the barrier in his heart. This was very normal, just like Luo Fan. If there was suddenly an existence that was not a true saint who could do something that a true saint could not, he would not dare to believe it or be willing to believe it. "Who are you?" Luo Fan asked calmly. At this time, he didn't drag him out to interrogate him, but to make him answer. Therefore, he naturally could not keep waiting for the other party to ask questions. The man slowly came to his senses and said, "I won't tell you what you want to know. I seem to have the ability to search one's soul." Luo Fan said calmly, "You want to search my soul?" The middle-aged man's expression froze. Then his expression became fierce, and he said, "Don't even think about it." As he said that, his eyes flashed with violence and confusion. There seemed to be an extremely terrifying power brewing in his body, which could erupt at any time and cause an earth-shattering explosion. At this time, Meow's face was filled with shock as she shouted, "Quickly stop him! He's going to self-destruct." However, before she could finish her sentence, she realized that Luo Fan's palm had already pressed against the middle-aged man's body. As he pressed down, the middle-aged man's entire body shook. It was as if his entire body had suddenly become stagnant, and everything calmed down. The power that was about to self-destruct also completely subsided, and the terrifying impact that was about to explode also disappeared. Meow opened her mouth, but she could not say anything. At this moment, she once again felt how terrifying Luo Fan was. The feeling that the middle-aged man in front of him was very powerful seemed to have become an illusion from his previous life at this moment. Luo Fan did not stand on ceremony at this moment. With a thought, he immediately searched the middle-aged man's memory. After a long time, he casually smashed the middle-aged man into pieces with a complicated expression on his face. The space-time dimension that made up the middle-aged man's body completely collapsed and turned into the most basic space-time dimension. The space-time dimension rushed into the abyss below and began to suppress and calm the terrifying chaos in the abyss. The abyss gradually returned to its original appearance. "How is it? What's his identity?" Meow asked curiously. "He's a bandit." Luo Fan sighed and said to Meow. The words that the air hostess and the other 8 people beside her could not believe their ears. "How is that possible?" Meow instinctively said, "His true identity. He's a bandit from your higher space-time dimension. The reason why he appeared here was because of an accident. What he was doing before was to find a way home." Luo Fan said calmly. Meow had an indescribable expression on her face. She seemed to be sorrowful, regretful, and even more so, inexplicable pity. After a while, she came back to her senses and said, "However, the method he used should be very unusual. Otherwise, you wouldn't have killed him." Meow knew Luo Fan very well. She knew that Luo Fan had never been a bloodthirsty person. However, he knew that Luo Fan had never been a bloodthirsty person. To him, as long as no one spoiled his plans or displeased him, he would not kill them. Since he had killed the middle-aged man so decisively just now, then the middle-aged man must have gone overboard with something. The method he uses is to actively shatter space-time dimensions, absorb those fragments, extract their essence, and condense the power within to build a path to higher space-time dimensions, Luo Fan said. His words were calm. However, The cruelty contained within was truly shocking. He took the initiative to shatter the space-time dimensions. How'd he do it? What were those space-time dimensions? After shattering it, what happened to the creature inside? So what if there were many space-time dimensions connected to the space-time dimension? As long as one thought about all of this in detail, one would be able to tell just how much sin that middle-aged man had committed. He got off lightly, when Meow said bitterly. At this moment, the situation in the abyss ahead gradually calmed down. This kind of terrifying vibration that came from the abyss was earth-shattering. It also gradually subsided. When everything calmed down, the abyss had already turned into a vast and boundless space-time dimension again. It formed an incomparably deep and strange place. There seemed to be countless creatures formed from space-time dimensions living inside. Some were strong, while others were weak. They vaguely formed a perfect ecosystem. When Meow looked at the abyss, and her eyes lit up, she casually sent the cores of the creatures that she had collected from the abyss into the space-time dimension inside the abyss. After these creatures' cores entered, they naturally disintegrated and turned into countless fragments that integrated into the space-time dimension. They began to undergo an extremely grand reincarnation cycle, transforming into a certain kind of creature that was born in the space-time dimension. Seeing her actions, Space Maiden also sent the cores that she had collected into the space-time dimension. When Meow waited for a long time, but she did not see Luo Fan move. She turned to look at Luo Fan with a puzzled look in her eyes. The other cores don't matter, but these cores I have here can be of some use in opening the door. Luo Fan only smiled. In order to construct a path to return to a higher space-time dimension, the middle-aged man had committed a great sin. Although Luo Fan felt that he had taken the wrong path, his hard work over the years was not in vain. In order to construct a path to return to a higher space-time dimension, the middle-aged man had committed a great sin. These effects fused with the formation and formed the foundation of the formation to become so powerful and vast. Then, through this array formation, they were transferred to the creatures created by the array formation. In other words, they were transferred to the cores that were in the hands of Luo Fan and the others. What's the use? Well, Meow's eyes lit up when she heard this. She even felt a little regretful. She regretted sending those cores into the space-time dimension. Although she had some sympathy and some young girl's romantic thoughts, all of this could not suppress her desire to return home. If those cores could help her return home, she would not feel any discomfort even if she kept too many of them and consumed too much. From this aspect, there wasn't much difference between her and the middle-aged man. There are coordinates inside. Not only can it make it easier for us to open the door, but it can also determine a specific location in the higher space-time dimension. When that time comes, we won't have to be like headless flies when we enter. Luo Fan smiled. This benefit did not seem great, but it was enough to make Meow extremely happy. Is that really the case? If that's the case, won't we be able to bypass the surveillance of the Supremes? There were quite a number of Supremes in the higher space-time dimension, and there was no doubt that they were powerful. If they were just powerful, it would naturally not matter. It would not affect them too much. However, the worst thing was that those Supremes were constantly monitoring the entire space-time dimension. They would be able to detect any abnormalities in the space-time dimension immediately. If that was the case, if the three of them stepped into the higher space-time dimension, they would definitely be detected. When that happened, there might be huge trouble. As for the reason why Meow did not care previously, it was as if there was no such trouble. That was naturally because compared to returning home, this kind of trouble was bearable to her. We will only know after we try. Luo Fan only smiled faintly at this moment. Chapter 1839. Although he did not get confirmation from Luo Fan, just the fact that he could avoid being detected by the Supreme Being was already a great surprise to Meow. That's fine too. If we can make it so that the Supremes can't detect us, then it'll be much easier for us to step into the higher space-time dimensions, Meow said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled. What about the other restricted areas? Do you still want to go for a walk? Luo Fan asked. Every forbidden zone was completely different in the eyes of the many living beings in the space-time dimension. But in reality, there wasn't much difference in their nature. This forbidden zone was created by a being from a higher space-time dimension. So even if the other forbidden zones were slightly different, they should be similar in nature. Therefore, it could be said that there was no longer any value in the other forbidden areas. I'm leaving. I want to see if it's really a creature from a higher space-time dimension. Meow clenched his teeth and said. To her, living beings from a higher space-time dimension were her fellow countrymen. If he met someone from the same hometown, it was possible for him to meet someone he could get along with. Naturally, it was also possible for him to understand the changes in his hometown. Luo Fan and Kongnu were naturally indifferent. Although it was not really necessary to walk through the other forbidden areas, it could still bring them some benefits. Compared to stepping into the higher space-time dimensions, there was not much difference in essence. Under such circumstances, going to other restricted areas was naturally not a big deal. With that, the three of them brought their 8 followers and headed towards the second forbidden area. This time, they did not choose the weakest restricted area. Instead, they chose the one that was closest to them. That forbidden zone was not the strongest among all the forbidden zones. But it was not the weakest. It was in the middle level. This forbidden area was not an abyss. Instead, it was a mine. When he was within a certain range of the mine, there were no longer any signs of life, nor any signs of human habitation. Within this range of space-time dimensions, it was as if everything had been extracted, leaving behind only the frame of the dead space-time dimension. At a glance, the mine looked like a dead zone in this world. It lay quietly in the space-time dimension, using the structure of a space-time dimension to form its foundation. Its foundation gave people the feeling, but it was incomparably dangerous and terrifying. For Luo Fan and the other 2, this was of course nothing. However, the 8 followers who had grown up in the space-time dimension could no longer suppress their fear when they approached the forbidden zone. This restricted area is extremely dangerous. Since ancient times, only 1 or 2 out of thousands of people would be able to enter it. Moreover, after coming out, they would completely lose all their memories of the forbidden zone. Even their strength and potential would be completely extracted. No matter how strong you are, you will eventually become immortal. You won't even be able to break through the space-time dimension. This was the final moment. Finally, one of the 8 couldn't help but speak to Luo Fan. He wanted to dispel the idea of Luo Fan stepping into it. Regarding this, Luo Fan listened very seriously and kept nodding his head. However, in the end, he still stepped into the forbidden area without any hesitation. His actions left everyone dumbfounded, and at the same time, they had no choice but to make a choice. In their eyes, this forbidden area was so dangerous that it was obviously unrealistic for them to step into it willingly. However, they had already escaped from the forbidden area. If they escaped from this forbidden area again, how could they still have the face to follow Meow? Besides, the forbidden area seemed so dangerous. Didn't the 3 people in front of them return safely? This time, they might really be able to return safely too. These were all kinds of complicated thoughts. This caused the 3 of them to show signs of hesitation. In the end, the 8 of them looked at each other and saw determination in each other's eyes. Then, one by one, they followed Luo Fan, and the other 2 crossed the boundary of the forbidden area and stepped into it. I didn't expect you to follow me. Meow turned to look at the 8 of them and said with a smile, We are followers, so we naturally follow our master. The 8 of them smiled bitterly and said, Hearing this, Meow just smiled and said, Is that so? After saying that, he couldn't be bothered to care about them and just followed Luo Fan. The person who built this forbidden area is stronger than the mountain bandit from before, Luo Fan said with a smile. After stepping into this forbidden area, he felt that the surrounding space-time dimension had completely changed its nature, and it had vaguely turned into a state of condensed, deathly aura. Everything that originally existed in the space-time dimension fragments had been completely transformed into this deathly aura. Due to this transformation, the surrounding endless space-time dimension seemed so similar at this time. If it weren't for the difference in the space-time dimension between them, these space-time dimension fragments wouldn't even be seen as fragments and would be treated as a complete space-time dimension. Indeed, even I feel like my vitality is constantly being extracted here. When Meow sighed, as a living being formed by the space-time dimension, she was more affected by the changes in the surrounding space-time dimension than Luo Fan and Empty Maiden. At this moment, in the surrounding space-time dimension that had completely turned into deathly aura, every fragment exuded some kind of infinite attraction to vitality. This attraction acted on all living beings that stepped into it, continuously extracting their vitality and pouring it into the space-time dimension fragments, changing these dimensions and maintaining the complete existence of these space-time dimension fragments. The further in they went, the stronger the suction force became. In the beginning, when they stepped into the boundary, the suction force was still extremely weak, so weak that they couldn't even sense it. However, as they continued to move forward, after a few minutes, the suction force was already so strong that it could even completely suck away ordinary pseudo-saints. Even pseudo-saints might not be able to resist it. Such a terrifying suction force. For Meow, who was the most affected, the impact was self-evident. At this moment, although her expression was still calm, her body had basically formed a hole. The essence that had turned into a complete space-time dimension began to squirm slightly and gradually transform, isolating the surrounding suction force as much as possible. This was obviously a sign that she had been greatly affected. Since Meow had already been affected, the 8 followers behind her were living beings that existed in the space-time dimension, so they were affected even more. If it wasn't for the fact that their essence was extremely high and each of them was at the Supreme Emperor realm with incomparably rich vitality, they might have already been sucked dry by now. All of their vitality would have disappeared without a trace, and they would have died a violent death. However, even so, their expressions became extremely ugly, and each of them was resisting with difficulty. After walking for a few minutes, when Meow sighed, she turned her head and pointed her finger. Wisps of space-time dimension power naturally rushed out of her body. After being transformed by her, they had already turned into space-time dimension fragments that were filled with deathly aura. They turned into defensive barriers that directly enveloped the 8 of them. These defensive barriers were also absorbing vitality. However, the speed of absorption was tens of thousands of times slower than the original absorption speed of the outside world. Under such a speed of absorption, even Khanate Grand Luo cultivators would probably be able to withstand it and recover while being absorbed, let alone these existences at the Supreme Emperor realm. In an instant, the 8 of them felt their bodies lighten. The suction force that almost made them despair had completely vanished. It made them feel as if they had suddenly left the forbidden area. This change made each and every one of them look pleasantly surprised. Soon, the regret in the depths of their eyes had completely disappeared. At this moment, they were only glad for their choice. Fortunately, they had followed her into the forbidden area. If they hadn't stepped into the forbidden area, how could they have made their master acknowledge them? How could they have made her acknowledge them as one of them? They immediately expressed their gratitude to Meow. These defensive barriers were condensed from space-time dimensional fragments. Because they were of the same nature as the space-time dimensional fragments in the outside world, they were not affected by the suction force. Naturally, it was as if it didn't exist at all as it protected the 8 people inside. With this defensive barrier, it could be said that they were already walking on flat ground in the forbidden area. As long as the barrier wasn't broken, they wouldn't be in danger because of the surrounding environment. There was a mine in the mountain. The mine was extremely huge and pitch black, like an invisible mouth that was waiting for food to fall into its trap. Very quickly, they arrived in front of the cave. Inside the mine, the space-time dimensional fragments were condensed and constructed according to various special forms, forming the appearance of a mountain rock. And in the depths of these space-time dimensional fragments, there were always some special space-time dimensional fragments that emitted all kinds of different auras, showing different characteristics from other normal space-time dimensional fragments. Some of them were full of a special aura, and some of them contained some inexplicable principles in their own structure. These were the ores that were to be excavated in the mine. All of this, in the eyes of Luo Fan and the others, was extremely detailed, without missing anything. It seems that person is quite confident in his arrangements. Luo Fan looked at this scene and said with a slight smile, "I hope he can still be so confident later." Miao just sighed and said. As they spoke, they had already stepped into the mine. As soon as they stepped in, the surrounding space-time dimensional suction force on their vitality suddenly increased by 100 times. At this moment, the defensive barrier around the 8 of them shook inexplicably, vaguely showing signs of collapsing. The suction force on the 8 of them suddenly increased by several times. However, although it was strengthened, it was still within the range that they could bear. It was just that they could feel it from almost being unable to feel it. As the suction force on their vitality increased, the surrounding defensive barrier began to stabilize. Finally, it blocked the suction force that suddenly increased by 100 times, ensuring their safety. At this moment, light and shadow flowed around Miao's body, instantly absorbing the suction force, and his body completely regained its stability. As for Luo Fan and Empty Maiden, they were still the same as they were outside. It was as if there was no suction force around them at all, and they walked leisurely, naturally, and contentedly. Their movements were elegant and mysterious. It was elegant and profound, and it seemed to contain an unknown amount of principles. Unknown how many mysteries there were, and every step they took crossed an unknown number of space-time dimensions. After advancing another unknown number of space-time dimensions, when the cave entrance outside could no longer be seen, a new change suddenly occurred in their surroundings. A strange power began to gradually seep into everyone's body from the surroundings. This strange power was so incredible. It existed between the space-time dimension and normal power, vaguely seeming to have the characteristics of both, containing all kinds of indescribable effects. Under their invasion, the essence of their space-time dimension began to gradually disintegrate, gradually collapsing. Vaguely, it was about to completely erode the surrounding space, turning it into an ordinary space-time dimension. In this situation, Luo Fan and the air hostess frowned, but they had already completely resisted it. However, in comparison, Miao had to spend a lot more effort. Light and shadow flickered on his body, and it took him a while to completely analyze the various things around him, blocking this power outside. Even when Miao was in such a state, let alone the 8 people behind him. At this moment, they were in an even more sorry state. The defensive barrier around their bodies was assimilated in an instant, directly collapsing, turning into ordinary space-time dimensional fragments. Then, they turned into strands of illusory space-time dimensional power, and in turn, they were sucked into the surrounding cave walls, no longer able to be found. The defensive barrier that protected them disappeared, and the 8 of them appeared in the cave without any defenses. For a moment, life force erupted like a mountain torrent, frantically flowing out of their bodies and into the many lifeless space-time dimensional fragments around them. Vaguely, through the countless space-time dimensional fragments, their life force was transmitted to an unknown place. At this moment, the 8 of them cried out in alarm, and their power erupted in a frenzy. They wanted to resist this suction force, to resist the erosion of that power. But it was a pity. In the face of this suction force, in the face of this power, their strength seemed so weak. In the blink of an eye, the 8 of them had already lost half of their bodies, and they looked many times older. It was as if time had suddenly taken effect on them again, causing their age to suddenly increase by who knew how many billions of years. Seeing this scene, Miao frowned and casually patted. 8 defensive barriers that had undergone some kind of subtle modification were directly slapped out, enveloping the 8 of them, and instantly blocking the surrounding suction force and the erosion power. This allowed the 8 of them to stop the deterioration of their bodies in an instant. Instead, they gradually began to wriggle, slowly recovering. The 8 of you should wait here. The rest of the journey is too dangerous for you, Meow said at this time. She was naturally still confident that she could find a way to solve every problem and find a way to form a corresponding defense to protect the 8 of them. But, just like this time, every time she found a way, there would be a period of time when the defense was in a state of vacuum. To the 8 of them, this state was already a fatal danger. Even this time, they couldn't withstand it for just a breath of time. Next, there would be even more dangerous changes, and they would only be in more danger. By the time she found them, they might already be dead, their souls scattered, and they wouldn't be able to wait for her defense at all. When the 8 of them heard this, their expressions suddenly became incomparably ashamed. They couldn't even keep up with the defense. This kind of follower was simply worse than the most ordinary servant in the secular world. However, the danger just now had clearly told them that their vulnerability in this forbidden zone was still beyond their expectations. If they continued to follow them, they might accidentally lose their lives at any time. At that moment, the 8 of them could only respond shamefully and stop in their tracks. Luo Fan and the Air Maiden didn't care about what had happened just now. At this moment, the Air Maiden looked around and seemed to have vaguely comprehended something. The unique space-time dimension that was originally hidden around her body and completely belonged to her started to surface again. It faintly produced an indescribable fluctuation and started a mysterious adjustment. This adjustment was so mysterious and subtle that it couldn't be found at all for the time being. Compared to the Air Maiden, who was observing and comprehending the composition of the space-time dimensional fragments around them, Luo Fan took a step further. Now, he was tracing the source of this forbidden zone. The vitality absorbed by this suction force was constantly being transferred and circulated. Although the principles behind it were profound and unpredictable, and the changes were obscure and hard to find, there were still traces that pointed to a certain location in the depths of this forbidden zone. It pointed to the source of this forbidden zone. This forbidden zone seems to be fundamentally different from the previous one. Suddenly, this thought appeared in his mind. Originally, he thought that every forbidden zone in this space-time dimension should be related to the living beings in the higher space-time dimension. In fact, it could even be said that every forbidden zone in this space-time dimension should be created by the living beings in the higher space-time dimension. However, it seemed that his previous estimation was still arbitrary. At the very least, the forbidden zone in front of him now seemed a little different, as if there were some deeper secrets hidden in its depths. Chapter 1840. Following the feeling of pursuit, Luo Fan said, "Let's open a path." Then, he raised his hand and pinched the void, forming a strange handprint. Then, he pressed it to the side. In an instant, the originally extremely stable space-time dimensional fragment seemed to have turned into plasticine. It changed its shape at will, forming a side path that led to the depths of an unknown mine. At this moment, the entire mine seemed to shake. The originally deathly, still space-time dimensional fragments suddenly seemed to have an additional mysterious power that began to be released continuously. These energies continued to accumulate and condense within the mine. In the blink of an eye, they had already turned into countless illusory figures that filled the path that had just been formed, blocking the path in front of Luo Fan and the other 2. These phantoms were extremely strange. Some resembled animals, some resembled plants, some resembled mountains, some resembled rivers, and some even resembled seas and stars. They were densely packed in the path, appearing to be disorderly and not the least bit crowded. Instead, it was like a vast and boundless world. This power was a mysterious power that was between the space-time dimension and ordinary power. This power was mysterious and abnormal. It had the characteristics of the space-time dimension and also the characteristics of power. After appearing, it began to naturally stir the surrounding space-time dimension. Faintly, it actually had the characteristics of forming its own space-time dimension. Of course, it was only a trace. Not to mention, compared to Luo Fan, even compared to the Space Maiden, it was many times weaker. finally willing to show some traces? Luo Fan smiled faintly, and without hesitation, he walked toward the depths of the mine. During this process, the power formed. All kinds of strange, inexplicable, and abnormal shadows began to naturally scatter as if they had met their natural enemy. Naturally, a gap was revealed for them to pass through. However, it did not have any effect on stopping them at all. How is this possible? At this moment, there seemed to be such a voice coming from the depths of the mine. This voice was extremely strange. It contained incredible power, faintly causing the space-time dimension within the range of this voice to undergo subtle changes. But it sounded like a woman's voice. Moreover, it was clear and melodious. A woman. Miao frowned and said, regarding the style of the master of this forbidden zone, she was not used to it. But now, she realized that it was very likely that the person who did all of this was a woman like her. This messed up her original estimation and made her feel slightly complicated. The three of them were not ordinary experts. At this moment, if one were to follow this passageway, every step one took would be equivalent to traversing an unknown number of light years in the outside world. But here it kept going in. There was always a path, and there was no end to it. After the incredulous voice was heard, the power surging out of the mine rapidly increased. Vaguely, they formed a huge city wall in front of them, preventing them from going any deeper. However, this city wall was the same as the other phantoms from before. It was unable to obstruct them at all. After seeing them, it naturally scattered and revealed a path. He bypassed the city wall and continued deeper into the mine. At this moment, the voice in the depths of the mine no longer came. Only the changes in the surrounding power became faster and more intense. The phantoms that appeared became more and more powerful and more terrifying. However, no matter what the shadow was, it couldn't stop them. In fact, it didn't even cause any damage to them. Just like this, after countless waves of resistance had failed, they finally reached the end. They came to a strange space-time dimension and saw the source of this forbidden zone. This place was an extremely deep black hole. A black hole of space-time dimension. A terrifying black hole that devoured the power of all space-time dimensions and destroyed the power of all space-time dimensions. Around this black hole, endless vitality was constantly flowing into it. This vitality was not simple, ordinary vitality. It was the vitality that had undergone countless transformations and changes in space-time dimensions. Now, it already had various characteristics of space-time dimensions. The moment this vitality flowed into the black hole, an inexplicable fluctuation was produced, forming a slight change that could be sensed by others. It was also because of this change that Luo Fan was able to discover the existence of this place from so far away. It was also because of this that he was able to directly construct a path to reach this location from so far away. This is it. Miao looked at this location with shock in her eyes. This kind of black hole was beyond her imagination. She had never imagined that there would actually be such an existence that specifically targeted the existence of multiple black holes in the space-time dimension. She never expected that such a terrifying black hole would appear in front of her. Moreover, it seemed that this was not the final appearance of this black hole. It seemed to be just a transition stage in the evolution process of the final appearance. Luo Fan looked at this scene and frowned. Although he could sense that the source of this change was here from the outside, it was still separated by so many space-time dimensional fragments and so many layers of obstruction. Even he could not clearly sense and understand everything there. Therefore, it was only now that he personally came here and personally sensed the black hole in front of him. Only then could he truly confirm what the source was and truly understand who the living being inside was. It's actually you? Luo Fan sighed and said, "You know me?" At this moment, a woman's voice was heard from the black hole. This voice belonged to the woman who had been in disbelief earlier. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "The person I know is you from another space-time dimension." Following these words, a vague figure condensed in the black hole in front of him. This figure was so mysterious, so unbelievable. Even in the black hole, it was actually so clear. It was not a single blur. It was the figure of a woman. Moreover, this woman might be very unfamiliar to Meow, but the Space Maiden's eyes flashed with hostility when she saw her. That was because she knew this woman. That was the true saint's disciple, Qing Longzi. Why are you here? The Space Maiden furrowed her eyebrows. She said coldly. Hearing this, Qing Longzi, who was also the woman, looked puzzled and said, It seems that the relationship between you and the me from another space-time dimension is not a positive one, right? Back then, you gathered many true saints' disciples to attack us. You almost snatched heaven and earth away, the Space Maiden said coldly. There were some things that Luo Fan did not care about, but it was impossible for her not to care about. At this moment, Luo Fan did not speak and only smiled faintly. It was rare for the Space Maiden to stand up for him. So what if he let her stand up for him this time? That is me from another space-time dimension. We are not the same person, Qing Longzi sighed. Qing Longzi said. Compared to her from another space-time dimension, her current expression was much calmer. Of course, if one were to consider what she had done, then perhaps her calmness was more like a disguise. The Space Maiden furrowed her eyebrows and said, Why are you here? Under normal circumstances, this place is not a place that a true saint's disciple should come to. Qing Longzi from another space-time dimension said, faintly, Even rogue cultivators like you can come here. Why can't we true saints' disciples come here? This aroused Luo Fan's curiosity. You are also a true saint's disciple? Could it be that there are many space-time dimensions? Could there be so many true saints? This was a doubt that had existed in his heart for a long time. A true sage was a supreme existence. They were omnipotent and immortal existences. Even for him now, if he encountered any power of a true saint, he would not be able to resist at all. He would be easily erased by any will of the other party and be completely destroyed. There were only a few of such existences in a perfect world. In this case, if there were countless space-time dimensions in a perfect world and there were several true saints in each space-time dimension, then wouldn't there be countless true saints in a perfect world? This did not make sense no matter how one looked at it. However, it was even more unreasonable to say that the true saints in all space-time dimensions were the same and that they were all the same. After all, in every space-time dimension, there should be individuals from a different space-time dimension corresponding to these true saints. If they were all the same, then where did they go in the other space-time dimensions? Could they have been swallowed, integrated, unified? Thinking of this possibility, Luo Fan's heart felt heavy. After all, he also had countless corresponding individuals from other space-time dimensions. Although not all of them were friends with him, their way of thinking and behavior had a lot in common. It could be said that in every space-time dimension, he was equivalent to a confidant and a good friend of the true saint. If he wanted to become a true saint and wanted to completely swallow them and integrate with them, the result would obviously be too cruel. At this moment, when Luo Fan saw Qing Longzi, who was a true saint's disciple and had transcended his own space-time dimension, he finally had the chance to understand the truth. Of course not. Our various selves in different space-time dimensions all worship the same master. I only found out about this after transcending the space-time dimension, Qing Longzi said. How is this possible? The Air Maiden's expression changed instantly. Her thinking was not weaker than Luo Fan's. She quickly figured out all the things that Luo Fan was worried about. She also had the same worries and unhappiness. Doesn't this mean that if I want to become a true saint, I have to integrate with all the other selves? Or do I have to swallow all the other selves? She asked nervously. When Azure Dragon's son heard this, he smiled and said, Of course that's impossible. The true saint realm itself is a realm of absolute self. Any two people, even if they are from a different space-time dimension, can't be exactly the same as you. Such an existence, no matter how much they swallow and integrate, it will only affect your purity. How can you use this as a prerequisite to become a true saint? If this is the case, no matter how much such an existence devours and integrates, it will only affect your purity. How can this be the prerequisite for becoming a true saint? How is it possible that there is only one true saint left? The Air Maiden frowned and asked, "Do you know how many years it has been since the last true saint became a true saint?" Qing Longzi did not answer the Air Maiden's question. Instead, he asked another question. Hearing this, Luo Fan seemed to be deep in thought. Vaguely, he had already understood some of the things that he was worried about and the answers to some of the questions that he wanted to know. However, he still needed to hear it from Qing Longzi to confirm his conjecture. How long ago was it? The Air Maiden frowned and asked. I don't know how long it was either, but I know that I have been a disciple of a true saint for billions of generations, Qing Longzi said calmly. Hearing this, the Air Maiden was stunned at first. Then, an indescribable look of shock appeared on her face. Billions of generations and billions of years in each generation. In this way, the age that any true saint had existed for was probably beyond the limit that could be described by numbers. Can you think of it? Qing Longzi said, after such a long period of time, the individuals in any space-time dimension, how long do you think they can live? If they don't become true saints, how long do you think they can live? If they don't become true saints, there will always be a predestined fate. There will always be an end. After such a long period of time, the individuals in the different space-time dimensions of the true saints will definitely die over the long period of time. In the end, only the individual who has become true saints will be able to survive in the same space-time dimension. Therefore, there will naturally be countless space-time dimensions. However, true saints are the only ones. Even the 7 great true saints might not even be from the same space-time dimension. Perhaps they don't even come from the same space-time dimension. The air hostess murmured with a relaxed expression. There was also an indescribable shock. The relaxed look was that there was no need to devour or fuse with the cells from other space-time dimensions to have the chance to become true saints. However, the shocking thing was, there were so many space-time dimensions. Even if every true saint had so many selves from different space-time dimensions, there was only one true saint in the end. The difficulty of becoming a true divine was obviously beyond his imagination. No wonder true saints are so indifferent and allow their disciples to cultivate freely. They didn't even impart the key to becoming true saints to them. Perhaps it's not because they don't know, but because the consequences of imparting it to them would be extremely terrifying. Compared to the Air Maiden who was focused on the difficulty of becoming true saints, Luo Fan's focus was on another position. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind. The reason why he had such a thought was because he had derived a fact from the words of Green Dragon's son. That was if true saints were really the same true saints in countless space-time dimensions, then the number of disciples that the 7 great true saints accepted in each generation would definitely far exceed the imagination of all living beings. Countless space-time dimensions. Even if each space-time dimension only accepted one disciple, then the number of disciples would still be innumerable. Such an innumerable number of disciples. If he really personally imparted the true method of becoming true saints to them, then the number of true saints who could become true saints would probably be beyond imagination. In this way, after hundreds of millions of generations, the number of true saints in the Earth universe would probably not be more than hundreds of millions of true saints. With so many true saints, it was obvious that it had already far exceeded the capacity of the Earth universe. One had to know that the number of true saints that a perfect world could withstand was limited. Only a big world could withstand the birth of an infinite number of true saints and cultivate in it. In other words, before the Earth universe passed through the 9th calamity and became a big world, if they imparted the true method of becoming true saints, it would be destroying the Earth universe. How could a true saint do such a thing? As for imparting the method in a certain space-time dimension and not in other space-time dimensions, that was even more impossible. To a true saint, any space-time dimension was equivalent. The disciples that existed in it were all their true disciples. How could they be biased toward some disciples and give up on some disciples? Even if Luo Fan used his current way of thinking to think, it was impossible for him to do such a thing. Moreover, the way of thinking of a true, say, might be fundamentally different from his. It would be much higher, so it was naturally even more impossible for him to do such a thing. Reality is indeed countless times more complicated than imagination. After a while, Luo Fan could only sigh. There are some things that are much easier to not know than to know about. Qing Longzi's eyes revealed a distant and profound look, and his tone carried an indescribable sense of vicissitudes. The Space Maiden and Wen Miao vaguely knew that there was an extremely deep meaning hidden in her words, but in the end, they were unable to understand it like Luo Fan and could only frown. At this moment, Luo Fan spoke. There's no point in thinking about these things now. Let's talk about what you're doing here first. What do you mean by that? I'm here to seek transcendence and breakthrough. What does that have to do with you? Why do you have to interfere? Qing Longzi frowned and said. There was a hint of a punitive expedition in her expression. From her point of view, she clearly had the right to punitive expedition. Chapter 1841. Fellow Taoist, you seek transcendence. We seek transcendence as well. Fellow Taoist, you are now standing in our way of transcendence. How could we not come? Luo Fan simply smiled. These words caused Qing Longzi's expression to freeze. Then he smiled bitterly. She had been in the forbidden zone of this space-time dimension for so long that she had forgotten what the relationship between normal cultivators was like. For cultivators, nothing mattered. As long as the other party was interested, as long as the other party felt that it might be beneficial to them, then any cultivator would do it. What does this have to do with you? It's so naive that it's childish. At that moment, she could only say helplessly, Then, I wonder if you got what you wanted? Not yet, but I think it's almost time. Luo Fan just smiled. Hearing this, the Azure Dragon's son turned to look at his surroundings. He sighed again and said, This item is the foundation of my path. It's what I'll rely on a step into the higher dimensions of space-time. It's also the foundation for me to fight against a true supreme being. But I definitely can't give it to you. It shouldn't be too difficult to enter the higher space-time dimensions, right? At this moment, Wen Miao frowned and said, As long as that door is opened, won't we be able to enter the higher space-time dimension? Hearing this, an indescribable expression appeared on the Azure Dragon's face. He turned to look at Wen Miao. Countless rays of light flashed through his eyes, as if he was conducting an extremely deep analysis. Being stared at like this, Wen Miao could not help but frown deeply, feeling rather uncomfortable. After a long while, Azure Dragon said, So that's how it is. I didn't expect one of you to be a life form that descended from a higher space-time dimension. No wonder you're so confident that you can find the higher space-time dimensions. What do you mean? Wen Miao faintly felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what it was. Do you really think so? That door has never been pushed open since ancient times? Azure Dragon's son changed the topic and asked, Did someone push it open? Wen Miao exclaimed. This was completely different from what she had expected. In her imagination, it was like this. That door was so abstract and so powerful. Opening it required an extremely deep understanding of the space-time dimension. Although there were many powerful creatures in the space-time dimension, none of them should be able to open the door and step into the higher space-time dimension. Of course, the space-time dimension had existed for countless times longer than he had imagined. In such a long period of time, there was even a true sage from a different dimension that came here. Do you think it's possible that no living being has ever pushed open this door? Azure Dragon's son asked indifferently. Wen Miao's expression froze. This angle was something she had never thought of before. If he thought about it from this angle, his previous conjecture that no one could push open the door and enter would be proven true. He was still too arrogant and childish. There were so many experts, so many cultivators, and so many living creatures. How is it possible that none of them had been able to push open the gate and step into it? So what's the result? Wen Miao asked with an ugly expression. Behind that door is an existence even more vast than you can imagine. It was a strange place where countless space-time dimensions were mixed together. The higher dimensions of space-time were hidden within. It was in between the countless space-time dimensions and was no different from the other space-time dimensions. So many years had passed since ancient times. Countless people had pushed open the door and stepped into it, but not a single one of them had sent back any news. Not a single one of them had stepped into the same space-time dimension. There were even some who died because of the changes in the space-time dimension the moment they stepped through the door. Their souls were scattered. Azure Dragon's son did not keep them in suspense and directly revealed the answer. This answer caused Meow's expression to become sluggish. Even the expressions of Luo Fan and Air Maiden changed slightly at this moment. If that was really the case behind the door, they would still have to go through this final obstacle to find the existence of the higher space-time dimension. If that was the case, the process that they had previously thought of would be completely futile. However, an inexplicable sense of relief quickly appeared on Luo Fan's face. Compared to other living beings, they had Meow here. They also had the light ball that corresponded to the coordinates of a certain mountain in the higher space-time dimension that they had obtained from the mountain bandit. With these advantages, his chances of finding the higher space-time dimension were many times higher than other living beings. If he still did not have confidence in this, then he would have lived for so long in vain. However, this kind of understanding also made him even more determined to make a trip to the other restricted areas. After all, he had obtained this advantage by going through 2 forbidden areas here. He could also learn some things that he did not know before. He might be able to obtain more from the other forbidden areas. The more he knew, the more benefits he would gain when he stepped into the higher space-time dimension in the future. Seeing the changes in their expressions, Azure Dragon's son sank into deep thought. After a long while, she sighed, lifted her feet, and slowly walked out of the black hole. Not long after, she walked in front of Luo Fan. The structure of her body was completely different from the body of flesh and blood that Luo Fan knew. It was a structure formed by the combination of the space-time dimension and power. This kind of structure was vastly different from the life forms in this dimension. It was also quite different from the life forms in the higher space-time dimensions, which was Meow. However, it also contained all sorts of extremely fine and profound principles. Even when Meow felt as if he had comprehended something after reading it, and he faintly comprehended many things that he had never thought of before. I can't beat you right now, so I'll leave this restricted area to you. No matter what fellow Taoist wishes to do, feel free to do it. I only have one request, and that is that when you step into the higher dimensions, you must bring me along. The Azure Dragon's son sighed. Other than Luo Fan's strength and Meow's existence, there was an even more important reason that prompted her to make this decision. Perhaps she had already made up her mind a long time ago. She wanted to use this forbidden zone to step into the higher space-time dimensions and transcend. The possibility was extremely small, so small that she shouldn't put her hopes on it. The reason why he had waited until now to make the change was because it was probably because she couldn't see any other hope apart from this. Luo Fan stood there quietly and smiled faintly. If there's no limit to the number of people, it's naturally not a problem. Although this wasn't a complete agreement, the Azure Dragon son was already rather satisfied. She also didn't expect Luo Fan to treat her completely fairly. Putting herself in Luo Fan's shoes, she clearly knew that if she were in Luo Fan's position, she would definitely make the same decision. She wouldn't have an attitude of directly agreeing to it. Using the boundless vitality that is naturally emitted from the space-time dimensions as its power, condensing it into this kind of power that can change the space-time dimensions and condense space-time dimensional fragments. It's indeed a fantastic idea. Luo Fan looked at the black hole and couldn't help but sigh in admiration. The Azure Dragon's son smiled and said, "This is a method that I comprehended from the treasure that Master gave me. In terms of its roots, it's still Master's method, but it's not my method." When he heard this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and a hint of awe flashed across his eyes. If it came from a true saint, then he would have to pay more attention to this forbidden area. The importance he placed on this black hole had to be raised by at least one level. After all, once anything was related to a true saint, it would become extraordinary. It could even turn something rotten into something magical. Under such circumstances, even Luo Fan wouldn't dare to ignore it. It seems that he absolutely wouldn't dare to ignore it. I didn't expect it to actually come from a true saint. It seems that I didn't pay enough attention to this previously. Luo Fan didn't lie to cover up his previous lack of seriousness as he said this. This kind of frank performance. However, it made everyone present reveal a trace of an inexplicable expression. However, Luo Fan didn't care about this. At this moment, his heart moved, and he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already stepped into the black hole. The moment he stepped into it, endless waves, endless changes, and endless principles and mysteries naturally emerged. He sensed them and absorbed them to his heart's content. In a trance, he felt that he had complete control over the entire mining area. He had complete control over all the space-time dimensional fragments in the mining area. He had complete control over the power of all the space-time dimensional fragments that existed in the mining area. Thus, he could easily guide all the power and circulation of all the power within it. It was also at this moment that he sensed how this black hole resonated with his body and how it changed his body and the space-time dimension where he was. After sensing it for a while, Luo Fan sighed. His body shook, and the space-time dimension that was completely unique to him instantly erupted from his body. It swept across the surroundings and formed a strange defensive vacuum where he was, repelling the effects of the surrounding black hole on him. This black hole seemed to be absolutely pitch black, but in reality, there were many times more things inside than he had imagined. The entire black hole was actually formed by the condensation of countless space-time dimensions. These space-time dimensional fragments were densely packed together and intertwined with each other in a very subtle way. In the end, they transformed into all kinds of mysterious and indescribable structures, turning into the black hole in front of them. It produced an indescribable attractive force and caused indescribable changes to the body. If that's all, it can't be the means of a true sage, right? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's eyes flashed with doubt. If he hadn't said that this was a means that he had comprehended from the magic treasure given by a true sage, he would naturally have stopped at this step. He wouldn't have continued to delve deeper and search for the various mysteries on a deeper level. However, since it was said that it was a means that he had comprehended from the magic treasure given by a true sage, he had to spend more effort to comprehend it. This was not snobbishness, nor was it a random extension of the true meaning of a true sage. It was because of the meaning that a true sage represented. A true sage was not a celebrity expert or something like that. This kind of existence itself already represented an indescribably profound concept, and it itself represented a kind of supreme charm. Anything that was related to such an existence in itself already represented an unfathomable level. Under such circumstances, unless Luo Fan had already become a true sage and reached that level, he would be able to see everything he wanted to see with just a glance. Only when everything was a secret could he treat things that extended from such an existence lightly. Of course, this was what Luo Fan thought. However, it was not what he was thinking about now. At this moment, he only activated all the sensing abilities that he had. He sensed everything around him in detail and understood everything around him. He searched for the incomparably profound principles and mysteries that might exist around him. It was obviously not an easy task to search for these things. After a few days, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. He had found an inexplicable fluctuation that was hidden extremely deeply. This fluctuation was hidden in the deepest part of the black hole. It was hidden in one of the countless space-time dimensional fragments. It was extremely ordinary. It was extremely ordinary. It merged with so many space-time dimensional fragments that it could not be detected or found. This is the fluctuation. Luo Fan sensed this fluctuation, and there was an inexplicable doubt in his heart. Even in his senses, this fluctuation was so ordinary, so ordinary. If it appeared in other places, he might have already ignored this fluctuation. However, don't forget that the location where this fluctuation appeared was in this black hole. In this place, even the space-time dimension had been changed. Even Luo Fan's body had faintly been subtly affected. How could an ordinary fluctuation exist here safely? Could it spread in all directions in an extremely obscure manner? With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In the blink of an eye, his palm penetrated the obstruction of the space-time dimensional fragments, penetrated an unknown distance, and resisted the influence of an unknown number of layers of terrifying power in this black hole. Finally, it arrived at the space-time dimension. With a grab, it had already caught the fluctuation. For an existence at Luo Fan's current level, as long as it did not exceed the limits of his understanding, whether it was tangible or intangible, he could treat it as if it was tangible. Even if it was formless, he could still treat it as if it was a material object. He could treat an intangible existence that could change as a power, as if it was tangible, just like the space-time dimension, which could originally only be regarded as a certain change pattern between the space-time dimension and the space-time dimension. To him, this kind of intangible fluctuation could obviously also be regarded as a tangible thing. Therefore, if he wanted to catch it, there would naturally be no problem at all. However, although he had caught it, the feeling after catching it was completely different from what he had imagined. Because this fluctuation was so heavy in his senses, this fluctuation seemed to be as heavy as billions of space-time overlapping. Grabbing this fluctuation, he felt as if he was pulling an unknown number of worlds at the same time. He actually used up more than half of his strength to pull in front of him. It should be known that with Luo Fan's current strength, even if he did not use any other means, he only needed to slightly vibrate his muscles to destroy a world. Now that he wanted to pull this originally intangible fluctuation, if his strength was slightly weaker, he actually had to use up more than half of his strength. One could imagine the terrifying weight of this fluctuation. And it was also self-evident that this fluctuation was mysterious. Just this weight alone is enough to tell that this fluctuation must be related to a true divine. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. For him now, the only thing that could make him feel heavy was something that he could not understand. Otherwise, as long as it was something that he understood, no matter how heavy it was, even if it was the unimaginable weight of billions of worlds overlapping, he could use all kinds of special methods to reduce its weight and make it light, so that he could easily pick it up. In other words, for the ripples to be so heavy at this very moment, it definitely contained a mystery that he could not comprehend. Only then would it make sense. And for him, who had already passed the second great calamity, the most likely source of this existence was related to a true divine. With a thought, Luo Fan brought this wisp of fluctuation out of the black hole. When he stepped into the black hole, he seemed to be extremely relaxed. Almost in a flash, he had already arrived at the depths of the black hole. But when he left, it was as if he had suddenly turned into a snail. Every step he took seemed to exhaust his strength and his intelligence. Just like this, he spent a long time before he finally charged out of the black hole with great difficulty and arrived in front of a Meow and the others. What kind of fluctuation is this? At this moment, everyone noticed the wisp of fluctuation in Luo Fan's hand. Even the space-time dimension could be observed as if it was an actual object, so this kind of fluctuation was naturally not a problem. Azure Dragon's son was also in a state of shock. You don't know this wisp of fluctuation? Luo Fan looked at Qing Longzi and said thoughtfully, "Of course I didn't sense it." Qing Longzi smiled bitterly. At this moment, she felt rather defeated. She even vaguely knew why she, who was in a different space-time dimension, would have an unpleasant conflict with Luo Fan. The current her feelings towards Luo Fan were extremely complicated. If it was not for her rationality, she might also be extremely unhappy with Luo Fan and want to cause trouble for him. Chapter 1842. Luo Fan naturally did not care about what Qing Longzi thought. At this time, he only carefully sensed the wave in his hand. After losing this wisp of energy, the surface of the black hole didn't seem to have changed at all. It was still absorbing the vitality from every fragment of the space-time dimension in the mind, and it was still undergoing the mysterious transformation. However, if one looked closely, they would discover that the stability that it originally had was gradually disappearing. This black hole was constantly transforming towards the direction of collapse with the passing of time. It seemed that all the changes caused by external factors had started to be displayed on it at this time. It was no longer completely eliminated and suppressed like before. This change might not be noticed by ordinary people. However, which one of the people here was ordinary? Even Qing Longzi was already a disciple of a true saint who had transcended the space-time dimension. She had even changed the nature of her existence. How could she not notice such a change? Needless to say, Air Maiden and Wen Miao were more sensitive to the space-time dimension than Qing Longzi. With just a glance, they could comprehend all the subtle changes and would not be concealed. So the key is this wave. Wen Miao murmured. There was a look of realization and shock on her face. This wisp of seemingly invisible material was extremely minute. If she was not careful, she might have overlooked it. But it was precisely this wisp of fluctuation that had created such a shocking forbidden zone. What kind of wave was this? Could it be that this was the means of a true saint? Could it be that it was related to a true saint? At this time, Wen Miao had an unprecedented understanding of what kind of existence a true saint was. In the past, she knew that a true saint was omnipotent and that a true saint could do many things that she could not imagine. However, after all, it was extremely far away from her. For example, she might have a concept of splitting open the sky and earth and knew that it was extremely difficult. However, in her impression, there was only the word extremely difficult. As for how difficult it was and what kind of level one had to reach to achieve this, she had no idea. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for her to be so shocked by the means of a true divine. However, it was obviously different now. She had witnessed such a direct comparison with her own eyes. She had witnessed with her own eyes the results that such a minute wave could achieve. She finally had an intuitive understanding of the true divine's methods and was truly shocked. After the shock, the way she looked at Luo Fan changed slightly. Since a true divine was so powerful, if it was so unbelievable, then wouldn't Luo Fan, who had already stepped on the path to becoming a true sage, be even more powerful and terrifying than he had imagined? Wen Miao's mind was filled with all sorts of complicated thoughts. This caused her expression to fluctuate incessantly. Over here, only the air hostess felt the purest at this moment. At this moment, she was only paying attention to the wisp of fluctuation in Luo Fan's hand, and there were no other distracting thoughts in her mind. For her, it was natural for a true divine to be powerful. Luo Fan's strength. It was only natural. He didn't even need to think about it. In this way, the scene fell into silence. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard. That wisp of fluctuation was deep and unfathomable. It was so profound that even Luo Fan couldn't find any clues at the moment. Just as he was searching, a terrifying tremor suddenly came from behind him. The endless space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings let out a crackling sound at this moment. In this sound, it was as if the end of the world had arrived. It was as if everything was going to be destroyed, including everyone here. Such a change awakened Luo Fan and the others. This restricted area is going to collapse. In an instant, they all had a clear judgment. This collapse was brought about by the collapse of the black hole. The reason why the black hole would collapse was because there was no wisp of fluctuation to suppress everything. As a result, the various changes caused by the space-time dimensional fragments in the outside world would be related to the black hole, gradually causing the black hole to change bit by bit. As these changes accumulated bit by bit, it naturally caused the black hole to become unstable. In the end, it completely collapsed at a certain moment. In an instant, everyone present understood everything. In an instant, Wen Miao and the Space Maiden frowned. As the owner of this restricted area, Qing Longzi's expression relaxed at this moment. There was a look of relief in her eyes. As a disciple of a true saint, especially a true saint who had transcended the space-time dimension, Qing Longzi's understanding of cultivation and space-time dimension had reached an extremely profound level. She naturally knew what kind of things truly belonged to her. She also truly understood what kind of arrangements would allow her to achieve the success she wanted. Because she knew this kind of thing, she clearly knew that if this restricted area really relied on the wisp of fluctuation from a true saint to exist for a long time, then this restricted area would be meaningless to her. She definitely wouldn't be able to transcend through this restricted area that she wanted. If this wasn't even hers, then everything that developed from this foundation naturally wouldn't belong to her. But how could he achieve transcendence by relying on something that didn't belong to him? It was because she realized this that she felt relieved at this moment. That was because she was relieved about her previous choice. Previously, the reason why she chose to give this restricted area to Luo Fan was because she felt that there was a greater hope if she followed Luo Fan. However, it was also because Luo Fan was too powerful and she didn't have the confidence to guard this restricted area under his shadow. Therefore, she was obviously somewhat resentful about giving this restricted area to Luo Fan. And this resentment had obviously completely disappeared at this moment. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Looks like we should have one more restricted area killer." His heart stirred slightly. He swung the wisp of fluctuation in his hand, and all the space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings were instantly suppressed. Then, he swung the wisp of fluctuation again. With a strange transfer of the space-time dimensional fragments, the few of them were thrown out of the restricted area. They appeared outside the restricted area and looked at the towering mine in the distance. And beside them, the 8 followers of a Miao also appeared naturally. It was as if they had been standing here all along. You can actually use this wisp of fluctuation. Qing Longzi stared at Luo Fan in shock and said, "How strong was a true divine stage existence?" Only she, who was a disciple of a true divine, could truly understand how profound it was, because she was clear when she saw that wisp of fluctuation. She had already determined that this wisp of fluctuation would definitely not be of help to Luo Fan. It would only be a burden to him. He would at least need to be a burden for a long period of time before he could be able to understand the mystery of this wisp of fluctuation. Only then would he be able to understand the hidden principles within. But Luo Fan's method had completely subverted her views. He had only gotten hold of this fluctuation for a short period of time, and he could actually control it as if it was his own limbs. He could easily change the space-time dimension by using the power of this fluctuation. It's just a simple matter to use it. It's just like how ordinary people don't need to know the principles of guns to be able to use them. They don't need to know the principles of flames to be able to use them to roast meat. But you have to understand, I'm still too far away. Luo Fan only smiled. As he spoke, he did something that made everyone present dumbfounded. He threw this wisp of fluctuation into the mining area and allowed it to sink into the depths of the Forbidden Zone. As it started to tremble slightly, it stirred the space-time dimension fragments within the Forbidden Zone even more intensely. This caused the Forbidden Zone to collapse even faster. Can you retrieve it?" Qing Longzi asked expectantly. Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said, "Of course not." "Then, why did you throw it away?" Qing Longzi's face turned pale with fright. At this moment, Wu Miao's eyes were also filled with disbelief. Clearly, he could not understand what Luo Fan was thinking. However, at this moment, a look of understanding appeared in the empty maiden's eyes, and a faint smile appeared on her face. She seemed to have understood Luo Fan's meaning. "Because this is just my burden." Luo Fan only smiled and said this. However, he did not go into depth to explain the meaning of this sentence. These words instantly caused Wu Miao and Qing Longzi's expressions to become dull. They had no way of understanding what Luo Fan was thinking at all. Burden? This wisp of fluctuation might be extremely heavy. Perhaps its suppressive power would affect people greatly. However, compared to the principles and mysteries contained within it, what was this? Who would abandon this fluctuation because of such a burden? Wasn't this giving up eating for fear of choking? If you don't want it, I want it, Qing Longzi shouted. His eyes flashed, and he raised his hand to grab at the space-time dimension fragments that were becoming extremely chaotic in the Forbidden Zone. In the blink of an eye, a power that was somewhere between space-time dimensions and power burst forth from his body. It quickly weaved in the void space, turning into an extremely complicated, mysterious, and unfathomable palm. It reached into the fragment of the pair of empty space fragments and grabbed onto the wave of energy. I caught it. Qing Longzi's eyes were filled with joy. However, in the next instant, her expression changed drastically. The power in her body surged frantically, and the space-time dimension that formed her body began to change rapidly. Boundless vitality erupted continuously, turning into all sorts of terrifying power. She frantically poured it into the invisible palm and tried her best to maintain it. Unfortunately, the result disappointed her. This also shocked Miao and the Empty Maiden. That was because it was as if the palm didn't exist at all. Even the speed of its descent didn't slow down at all. It continued to descend, stirring up the space-time dimensional fragments around it, completely releasing the deathly stillness within and causing destruction. During this process, Qing Longzi's extended palm kept grabbing at the fluctuation. From the way he was using his strength, it was clear that he was using all his strength to grab it. This situation. It was clear that all of Qing Longzi's actions, methods, and power were unable to affect that fluctuation at all. In fact, they could not even cause the slightest change in the fluctuation. This scene, coupled with the way Luo Fan had grabbed the fluctuation and swung it around effortlessly, was enough to shock anyone. How could it be so heavy? Qing Longzi's veins popped up on her face, and she seemed to have lost her original beauty as she shouted. However, it was a pity that those fluctuations wasn't an obedient puppy. Her shout was unable to affect the ripples in the slightest. That fluctuation continued to descend into the depths of the void and was gradually drowned in the chaos of the countless space-time dimension fragments. In the end, it was impossible to find. Qing Longzi's power had its limits. After a long time, it was finally completely cut off and could no longer extend further. In the blink of an eye, it was as if an extended spring had suddenly been released, and an earth-shattering rebound force was unleashed. This caused a shocking commotion. It turned around and returned. It caused the space-time dimension around Luo Fan and the rest to be thrown into a mess. Fortunately, Luo Fan was here to suppress it. Otherwise, this kind of rebound, they would probably end up in an extremely pathetic state. At this moment, Qing Longzi's face was ashen, and there was an indescribable emptiness in her eyes. Everything that happened just now was too much of a blow to her. It was so huge that she didn't dare to believe everything that had happened just now. Relax. This kind of thing is inevitable when you follow him. Miao comforted her at this moment. These words obviously didn't have any effect of comforting her. Instead, it made Qing Longzi's expression turn even uglier. She was the disciple of a true saint. She had cultivated for billions of years and had never encountered such a thing before. All this while, it was others who felt this kind of shock from her. Okay. After a long time, Qing Longzi finally couldn't suppress the doubts in her heart and asked Luo Fan, "Why did you throw that fluctuation?" Her expression was extremely serious, and her determination to find the answer was extremely firm. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Didn't I already say that it would only be a burden?" At this moment, the few of them were already in front of another restricted area. This restricted area was a stone forest. At the very least, it looked like a stone forest. As far as the eye could see, it was densely packed with stone pillars of all shapes and sizes. Some were tall, and some were short, and their colors were all strange. It was extremely strange, and it seemed to contain some kind of special law and principle. Burden. Don't tell me that the principles and mysteries within can't suppress those messy burdens. Qing Longzi continued to ask relentlessly. At this moment, She directly stood in front of Luo Fan and raised her head to stare into Luo Fan's eyes. She didn't even blink, and her pupils seemed to be frozen as she stared deeply into his eyes. This kind of attitude made the air maiden a little unhappy. She said indifferently, "This is our cultivation secret. There's no need to tell you." Cultivation secret? Qing Longzi's body trembled, and he suddenly woke up. To any cultivator, the secret of cultivation was the most important secret. Any secret could be inquired about, but once the secret of cultivation was inquired about, it was very likely that it would end in a fight to the death. "That's right, it's the secret of cultivation," the Air Maiden said calmly. When he heard this, Luo Fan also shut his mouth. Originally, to him, it was not a big deal to tell the other party that the burden referred to the principles and profoundness of the true saint. However, since the Air Maiden had already said this, he naturally would not overturn her conclusion. After all, compared to the Air Maiden, what was Qing Longzi? "Let's go. I think the owner of this restricted area should be waiting for us," Luo Fan said with a smile. As he spoke, wisps of indescribable fluctuations appeared in the stone forest. Amidst these fluctuations, the entire stone forest blurred slightly and gradually disappeared, leaving only a boundless desert where the stone forest had originally been. A piece of space-time dimensional fragments had spread out to form a barren land. This change finally attracted the attention of the Air Maiden and the others, and they turned their gazes to where the stone forest had originally been. How could it disappear just like that? Well, Miao frowned and said, the disappearance that she was referring to was, of course, not the disappearance that had disappeared in front of her. Instead, it was the kind of disappearance that had disappeared from all her senses, from all her understanding, the kind of disappearance that had disappeared. That's right, at this very moment, that forbidden zone, that stone forest, had indeed completely disappeared from Miao's senses, as if this stone forest had never existed, and this forbidden zone had never existed. Unable to figure it out, Miao grabbed a follower beside her and asked, "What's going on? Is this the strangeness of the restricted area?" The follower that was captured was a powerful life form of the space-time dimension. Naturally, he was clear about the many restricted areas in the space-time dimension. When he heard this, he hurriedly said, "Master is wise. There has never been such a change in this restricted area. At least, there has never been such a rumor. This is the first time this has happened in my memory." These words made Miao frown. The first time it had appeared? Could it be that the restricted area had always been hiding itself and was only revealing its strangeness now? Is there a need to ask? He's hiding from us. Qing Longzi looked at where the stone forest had originally been, but there was an indescribable expression in his eyes. This expression was a little sympathetic, but it was also a little funny. Chapter 1843. The Lord of the Restricted Area was definitely the kind of absolute power that could overlook the entire space-time dimension. He was a powerful existence that all the experts and living beings in this space-time dimension could not look directly at. It went without saying that the arrogance of such an existence was very strong. Normally, even in the face of death, he would never give in. However, it was precisely this kind of Lord of the Restricted Area that used a method to hide the entire restricted area when Luo Fan and the others arrived. This kind of cowardly behavior was really beyond Miao's imagination. It was also because it was beyond imagination that Miao could not think of this fact for a moment. Other than hiding from us, I can't think of any other possibility. Qing Longzi sighed. As someone who was also in a restricted area, Qing Longzi understood the Lord of the Restricted Area very well. It must be known that Luo Fan had gone to 2 restricted areas previously, and both of them were completely destroyed. Moreover, each restricted area only took a short period of time to completely disappear. It went without saying how exciting this kind of change was to the Lord of the Restricted Area. It was obviously not strange that the Lord of the Restricted Area had some misgivings in his heart and hid the restricted area. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that her mining area did not have any concealment methods, she might have already hidden the restricted area before Luo Fan stepped into it. At this time, Luo Fan only shook his head at this time and sighed. He pointed at where the stone forest originally was. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable power surged out from his hand and poured into it. In an instant, the space-time dimension fragments produced all kinds of mysterious changes and began to undergo some kind of extremely complicated and extremely subtle reorganization. As this change continued, a stone forest faintly appeared. At this moment, Miao's expression changed. She also began to feel the existence of the stone forest more and more directly. There's actually such a powerful concealment method. This restricted area is not simple. This was her judgment. In her senses, she could see that the restricted area was continuously appearing at this time. However, she had no way of knowing the fundamental principle of its concealment. It was as if the restricted area was there to begin with and was only gradually lifting the barrier that was covering her senses. As for other things besides this, as for the principles behind the forbidden zone, he couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he tried. However, no matter how shocked Miao was, Luo Fan did not stop moving. As the power that rushed out of his hand changed more and more violently, the stone forest finally reappeared not long after, as if it had never disappeared. It still covered the area in front of them. "Why must you force me?" At that moment, a voice rang out from within the stone forest. It was impossible to tell if this voice was male or female, old or young. It was so grand and shocking. It was as if the entire space-time dimension was emitting a sound that came from all directions and was transmitted into everyone's ears. Luo Fan's expression didn't change as he said, "I just want to see your origin." Such impolite words were a great offense to any cultivator. But, however, not a single person's expression changed because of this. In the cultivation world, the strong preyed on the weak. The strong could naturally decide everything. They could know everything. Although wanting to know the origin of the weak was a great offense to the weak, to the strong, it was their right. The person who spoke just now was obviously the lord of the restricted area. The way he spoke was not through his body, but through the vibrations of the entire stone forest, using the vibrations of the entire restricted area to form words. As a result, his words had such a special quality. At that moment, the vibrations of the entire stone forest were a bit chaotic. It seemed like the lord of the restricted area was saying something. However, due to the trembling of his mind, he couldn't control the stone forest perfectly and make it speak. After a long while, only then did the vibrating sounds within the stone forest become smooth again. Only then did the sounds they formed once again converge into a single voice. "Why must you do this? The origin of us cultivators is an absolute body. If you want to see my origin, you will fight me to the death," the voice said. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, "It seems that your origin is hiding a great secret." These words caused the voice to become chaotic again. However, this time, after the voice was smoothed out, it didn't say anything else. Instead, the stone forest suddenly began to expand rapidly and crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had become tens of thousands of times bigger than before. In an instant, Luo Fan and the others were completely wrapped in the stone forest. At that moment, all of them felt an indescribable power appear out of nowhere and affect their bodies. This power didn't have any offensive power, but it had a teleportation effect. After it affected them, it wanted to randomly teleport them in different directions and scatter them. This was the power of the stone forest. In an instant, this thought flashed through everyone's mind, and they understood the source of the teleportation power. The 8 cultivators who were Miao's followers showed expressions of terror, and an indescribable sense of despair appeared in their hearts. They were able to exist freely in the restricted area because of the protection of Luo Fan and the others. If they were randomly teleported away, it would be equivalent to breaking away from the protection of Luo Fan and the others. At that time, what awaited them would be facing the power of the restricted area without any cover or defense. To them, it would be death and their souls would be destroyed. It would be the deepest despair. No, their faces were filled with terror, and they even spat out similar words and phrases one after another. At that moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a thought, an indescribable power was released from his body and enveloped everyone present in the blink of an eye. With a slight tremble, the power of the teleportation was isolated, allowing everyone present to escape the power of the teleportation. Puff! There was a soft sound. Many of the surrounding stone forest suddenly collapsed. In the blink of an eye, a large empty space had been cleared out. It made it seem as if this area didn't belong to the stone forest or the restricted area. In the face of such a change, the stone forest changed again. Wisps of mysterious power began to quickly condense and weave around the bodies of Luo Fan and the others. They constantly combined and formed the shadow of a stone pillar. They began to radiate around Luo Fan's body like a millstone. The power that isolated the power of the stone forest came crashing over. At that moment, an earth-shattering sound was emitted from the point of contact between the two. The entire space-time dimension was filled with this sound in an instant. At that moment, countless beings cast their gazes toward this location from all directions. It's starting again. This is the third restricted area, right? All sorts of thoughts appeared in their minds. Among them was the Lord of the restricted area. Compared to the other beings, the lords of the restricted area were more concerned about this place and more afraid of the changes here. This was because they knew that the changes here were very likely what they would have to face next. If they still couldn't get rid of Luo Fan here, then what awaited them would most likely be the outcome of the previous two restricted areas. That kind of ending where the restricted areas would be destroyed and they would be suppressed or killed. Just who is this person? He's actually so hostile to us restricted areas. This thought flashed in the mind of one of the lords of the restricted area. A fierce emotion emerged from the bottom of his heart. If it wasn't for the fact that this place was a restricted area, it was an absolutely independent place where other beings couldn't interfere. Perhaps he had already interfered at this time and directed his power here to help this restricted area attack Luo Fan and the others. However, although they couldn't interfere, they were still paying close attention to this place. They did everything they could to analyze the methods and power of Luo Fan and the others. Regarding all of this, Luo Fan was naturally well aware of this. However, he couldn't be bothered to care, although this space-time dimension was mysterious. But to him, there was nothing that could threaten him, even if it was such a strange space-time dimension change. To him, it was just interesting. It wasn't enough to really affect him. Facing the crushing power of the stone forest, he raised his hand and pointed at the air. In the blink of an eye, the boundless power gathered and turned into a palm. With a slight tremble, it moved in a mysterious trajectory and instantly inserted itself into the cracks of the boundless power. It easily destroyed the power and emptied the surroundings, causing the stone forest to become extremely calm. Then, with a thought from Luo Fan, the power of the palm suddenly turned into a path that traversed towards the depths of the stone forest. Through the various changes in the stone forest, he had already discovered the source of the changes. Perhaps that place wasn't the true source of the restricted area, but it was definitely related to it. In other words, the Lord of the restricted area might not be there, but there were definitely enough traces left there. Under these circumstances, if he wanted to find the Lord of the restricted area, going there was clearly the best choice. This path was like a supreme existence that would not move for eternity. As it stretched out, it suppressed some of the movements and changes in the stone forest. No matter how hard they tried, they were unable to move like before. The various powers that were constantly gathering seemed to have their source blocked, unable to move at all. "Let's go," Luo Fan said to the air hostess and the others. As he spoke, he stepped onto the path and slowly followed it into the depths of the restricted area. This stone forest looked like a stone forest, but in truth, it contained countless dimensions of space and time and countless universes. If an ordinary cultivator wanted to cross this forbidden zone by walking normally, it would be impossible even if they spent billions of trillion years. The power of the restricted area itself was enough to make it impossible for them to leave even if they died of old age. However, this was clearly not a problem for Luo Fan. Under the path formed by this power, the countless dimensions of space and time in the restricted area were like the cornerstones of this path. Countless universes were like the cornerstones of this path. They could only support this path. However, they couldn't produce much effect. The Lord of the restricted area naturally had to put in a lot of effort to stop Luo Fan and the others. For a time, countless dimensions of space and time swarmed over. Countless stone pillars started to change wildly, producing all sorts of indescribable power. They did their best to bypass the suppression of the path and gather on it, wanting to stop Luo Fan and the others. However, it was a pity that all of this, for this path, it was useless. It was fine if the power didn't get close to the path. It could still exist and produce all sorts of effects that would shock any cultivator. However, once they got close to a certain range of the path, they would be instantly suppressed and turned into the cornerstones of the path. They would become a part of the power that supported the path, unable to produce the effects that the Lord wanted. With all these changes, the path no longer looked like a path. Instead, it looked like a tunnel, a deep tunnel that led to an unknown place. The surroundings of the tunnel were filled with endless power. It was filled with endless power, covering everything. Meow and the others couldn't see anything behind the power. It was as if the entire world, the entire space-time dimension, and all the universes that they knew had turned into this power. However, this change also resulted in a result, and that was the destination of the path. At this moment, the place in front of him had become even more conspicuous. Vaguely, there seemed to be a deep vortex at the end of the tunnel. This made Meow and the others understand. Although this path was extremely long, if it was really measured by distance, it was probably trillions of light years away. However, for Luo Fan and the others, it only took them half a day to completely cross it. When they came to the end of the path, they finally saw the source that Luo Fan wanted to reach. It was a vortex that was faintly discernible, seemingly illusory, yet real. This vortex was formed by the condensation of a mysterious power. Even the fragments of the space-time dimension no longer existed in this vortex. Or rather, they had been completely twisted apart and turned into something more fundamental. Behind the vortex, there was an indescribable aura. This aura was extremely obscure and subtle. Under normal circumstances, even Meow and the others would find it difficult to detect the existence of this aura when there were countless space-time dimension fragments and countless mysterious powers in the surroundings. However, at this moment, the surroundings were completely covered by that terrifying power. In a situation where there was only this path apart from that power, this aura was very obvious, and everyone present could clearly sense its existence. What a strange aura! Meow frowned. At this moment, the Air Maiden and Azure Dragon's expressions became solemn, and an indescribable doubt appeared between their brows. This aura doesn't fit in at all with the space-time dimension. No, it doesn't fit in with this perfect world. The Air Maiden's eyes flashed as she said this. This sentence instantly caused Meow's and Azure Dragon's expressions to change drastically. How is this possible? They exclaimed almost at the same time. Of course, this did not refer to the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up, nor did it refer to the perfect world of a certain space-time dimension. Instead, it referred to the perfect world of the entire Earth universe. What did being incompatible with the entire Earth universe mean? It meant that the aura came from another perfect world. It meant that it came from another perfect world that was equivalent to the Earth universe. However, this was obviously impossible in the minds of Meow and Azure Dragon. It must be known that the distance between the two perfect worlds was not as tightly connected as the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up, which was practically attached to the Earth universe. The distance between the two perfect worlds was an incomprehensible chaotic state. Although the chaotic state could be used as a unit to measure the distance, This unit was only meaningful to true saints. To all existences below the true saint level, the chaotic state, even if it was space-time with countless zeros behind the decimal point, was still an unimaginable distance that could not be crossed. Under such circumstances, when a living being from another perfect world appeared in a perfect world, any living being would only think of a true saint. Meow and Azure Dragon were no exception. At this moment, their expressions became extremely ugly, and there was a vague sense of panic hidden in them. Could it be that a true saint from another world wants to invade our world? Azure Dragon said with an extremely solemn expression, "If that's the case, then it's bad. I think we should leave this place as soon as possible. Being caught in the middle of a war between two worlds, small ants like us will die if we're not careful, and our souls will scatter," Meow said at this moment. The aura of another perfect world. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes were burning, and there was an inexplicable sense of excitement in them. However, he was not as panicked as Meow and Azure Dragon. Meow and Azure Dragon did not understand the transmigration between two perfect worlds. In their hearts, they felt that it was extremely unfathomable, and they could not think about it rationally. However, he was different. Chapter 1844. How could it be another perfect world? Qing Longzi muttered with shock and an indescribable sense of vigilance. As a disciple of a true divine, she could be considered to have finished her apprenticeship. She still had a different perspective from other cultivators. She saw the entire perfect world as her home and the other perfect worlds as her enemies. Under such a perspective, suddenly seeing a cultivator from another perfect world was like suddenly seeing a person from another country. The first thing that came to her mind was, of course, whether the other party was a spy, whether he was here to inquire about information, and whether he was here to prepare to harm this perfect world. Luo Fan did not say anything at this moment. He raised his hand and pointed at the whirlpool in front of him. In an instant, a strange power suddenly rushed into the whirlpool and began to stir with the whirlpool. It gradually merged with the whirlpool and went one step further, developing in the direction of controlling the whirlpool. At this moment, a terrifying sound came from the whirlpool. All kinds of indescribable movements came from it. Strands of power belonging to the space-time dimension began to appear from the depths of the whirlpool and continuously attacked the power that Luo Fan had sent into it. The effect of this attack created an earth-shattering movement, causing the whirlpool to show signs of collapsing. However, this was only a sign. Whether it was Luo Fan or the existence behind him, they both wanted to preserve the whirlpool. The changes that could cause the whirlpool to collapse were suppressed by them. Thus, although the whirlpool seemed to be on the verge of collapsing, it finally stabilized and continued to slowly spin in front of them. Suddenly, Luo Fan's eyes flashed. He raised his hand, and another wave of power rushed out and poured into the center of the whirlpool. Ah! A blood-curdling scream suddenly came from the whirlpool. Even the movements of the whirlpool at this moment could not be suppressed. It was as if the scream was not a sound at all. Instead, it was a kind of terrifying spirit wave that was directly transmitted into the soul. At this moment, Luo Fan merely smiled in the face of such a situation. He had poured his power into the vortex and was prepared to control the vortex's power. With a slight tremble, the extremely stiff resistance completely collapsed. In an instant, the whirlpool was completely under his control. After the whirlpool came under his control, he swept his eyes around and clearly knew the origin of the whirlpool. He understood where this whirlpool led to and what was behind it. It was a space-time. In other words, it was a world of its own. This part of the world was extremely strange. At first glance, it seemed to be no different from an ordinary world, but if one were to carefully sense it, one would realize that everything in this world was completely different from any world that Luo Fan had ever known. Regardless of whether it was the space-time dimension, the rules and laws, or even space-time itself, they all had their own characteristics. They were all related to the Earth universe, the Primordial world, and the Tianyuan world. The Geely Great World and other perfect worlds or great worlds were fundamentally different. This was the aura of another perfect world. In other words, this world was a part of another perfect world. This isn't our world. At this moment, Green Dragon's son exclaimed. He had also sensed the situation of this space-time through Luo Fan's control of the whirlpool and had formed his own judgment of this world. At this moment, this part of the world seemed to have started to undergo various subtle changes due to the influence of the whirlpool, according to the rules and laws, time, space, and the Great Tao. Even the space-time dimension seemed to have suffered some kind of indescribable corrosion. It started to gradually transform into the state that Luo Fan was most familiar with. This was clearly the world. This space-time was losing its state as another perfect world. At this moment, a figure appeared from the depths of the world. This was a figure with 3 arms. This was a figure with an octopus-like head. Its body looked ugly no matter how one looked at it. However, the aura that emanated from its body was extremely powerful. It was even only slightly weaker than Luo Fan's. Compared to the Sky Maiden, Wamiao, and even Green Dragon's son, it was much stronger. At this moment, this creature sensed the various changes in the world, and an indescribable hatred appeared in its eyes. It shouted, "All of you deserve to die." As it shouted, a boundless and terrifying power quickly gathered in the world and turned into an extremely thin strand of airflow that was the size of a strand of hair. It quickly rushed towards the whirlpool. In other words, it was charging straight towards Luo Fan and Qing Longzi, who were currently peering at this world and this heaven and earth. That strand of airflow surpassed time, space, space-time dimensions, and everything else. As it rushed out, it had already crashed into the whirlpool. Then, it passed through the whirlpool and reached Luo Fan and Green Dragon's son. Bang! Green Dragon's son's body couldn't withstand the impact of this strand of airflow at all. It instantly collapsed and turned into countless fragments that spread out in all directions like an explosion. After this change, Azure Dragon's son let out a muffled groan. Following that, specks of space-time dimensions continued to condense, and Azure Dragon's pale figure appeared above where he was originally. The aura on his body was more than 10 times weaker than before. It was obvious that even though the impact from before did not take her life, she had paid a great price and suffered great injuries. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ended up like this. In contrast, Luo Fan, who was also hit by that wisp of airflow, or rather was the focus of that wisp of airflow, did not react at all. It was as if this strand of airflow was really just an ordinary airflow. It stood there quietly and didn't even shake, let alone explode. What a powerful impact! However, Luo Fan sighed and raised his hand to grab at the air on the surface of his body. A strand of airflow rushed out of his body. It fell into his hand. This strand of airflow contained a kind of true divine level power, although it was very little. To an existence below true divine level, it was already considered an irresistible power. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan had already gone through the second great trial of heaven and earth and used the endless power to temper and improve his body during the process, he might not have been able to withstand the impact of this strand of airflow. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and rubbed it gently. With a slight tremble, the strand of airflow had already dissipated into nothingness. In the end, at a certain moment, this strand of airflow scattered in all directions as if it had never appeared. However, at this moment, many of the space-time dimensional fragments in the surroundings unknowingly collapsed. It even caused the boundless power surrounding this path to produce wave-like undulations that spread in all directions, forming an earth-shattering commotion. At this moment, the existence in the world had already arrived before the vortex. Its 3 palms joined forces and directly pierced into the vortex. Its power was terrifying. Its ingenuity had reached an indescribable level. It directly poured into the vortex, causing the vortex to undergo a shocking change. The 3 palms seemed to have grown tens of thousands of times stronger. They directly rushed out of the vortex, condensed all the power of the vortex, and grabbed at Luo Fan and the others. At this moment, the power that Luo Fan had integrated into the vortex was instantly repelled. Even though he had originally completely controlled the vortex, he was completely unable to come into contact with it at this moment. However, after a final observation, Luo Fan saw that the originally extremely perfect world had completely collapsed. At this moment, it had completely collapsed. The originally stable Great Tao and stable nomological law layer. Even the normal space-time had now completely shattered and turned into an indescribable existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos. It continuously flowed into the creature's body, continuously increasing the creature's own power and improving its essence. Sacrificing that world. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and he arrived above the vortex in front of the three palms. Then, he raised his hand and beckoned. The endless power around him was already under his control. As he moved, it condensed, transformed, and turned into three palms, brazenly blasting at the three palms that had rushed out of the vortex. Crack! An earth-shattering sound came from the collision. Vaguely, the entire space-time dimension produced a strong vibration at this moment. Vaguely, it was unknown how many space-time dimensional fragments suddenly collapsed. This kind of movement was even more shocking and terrifying than the previous two forbidden zones that had been destroyed. Moreover, it was unknown how many creatures could not maintain the stability of their bodies due to the intense vibration. Similarly, they completely collapsed in this terrifying turbulence and died a violent death, as expected of a forbidden zone assassin. Somewhere, a voice filled with fear and shock rang out. Although the source of this voice could not be found, all creatures instantly agreed with what this voice said. Even those who disagreed couldn't voice their objections after seeing the terrifying power that had appeared above the Stone Forest Forbidden Zone and the terrifying undulations that constantly affected the entire space-time dimension and made the entire space-time dimension as fragile as tofu. In an instant, all the creatures in the space-time dimension began to move. However, they did not come to the Stone Forest Forbidden Zone to stop the changes in the Forbidden Zone. Instead, they headed to various places in the space-time dimension and began to work hard to help the many creatures that had been greatly injured by the terrifying turbulence. Although the cultivators in the space-time dimension were not models of love and love. But this did not mean that there was no friendship between them. In fact, in any world, in any level of space-time dimension, as long as there were intelligent creatures, all kinds of gratitude and hatred between intelligent creatures would inevitably exist. However, this was not enough to attract the attention of Luo Fan and the Lord of the Forbidden Zone. At this moment, they only had each other in their eyes. The Lord of the Forbidden Zone from another perfect world had already gone completely crazy. At this moment, he did not care about anything else, even if it was something that he could bear. He was going to unleash his strongest attack and continuously attack Luo Fan. Boundless power, boundless might. There were all kinds of attacks that Luo Fan had never seen before, and it took him some time to understand them. They were constantly being displayed on his body. The three palms were constantly changing all kinds of seals on the road, constantly displaying all kinds of mysterious changes. The impact that erupted from them was so great that just the aura and fluctuations alone had already torn the road to shreds and completely collapsed the power of the Forbidden Zone that surrounded the road. All kinds of attacks were constantly pouncing on Luo Fan. He wanted to tear Luo Fan into pieces and completely annihilate his life source. That kind of soaring hatred had simply materialized and formed a real world. In the face of such a powerful offensive, Luo Fan did not fight back. No matter what kind of attack the other party threw at him, he was able to neutralize it in a moment of concentration. Traces of comprehension could be vaguely seen in his eyes, as if he had comprehended some inconceivable profundity during this process. Although the entire road had completely collapsed due to their battle, it was still filled with energy. However, Luo Fan still used his own power to protect the road under their feet, which had a radius of several hundred feet. This gave him, as well as Space Maiden, Wamiao, Qing Longzi and the others enough space to support themselves so that they wouldn't end up without a place to stand. As for safety, that went without saying. They could even protect their footholds. Luo Fan naturally wouldn't let those attacks miss him and attack them. This battle lasted for dozens of days. During this process, the entire space-time dimension seemed to be in the midst of doomsday. All kinds of terrifying tremors that could cause the space-time dimension to collapse and cause the death of all living beings in it were shrouded in every single moment. If it weren't for the fact that the powerful creatures in the space-time dimension had made preparations in advance and helped the living creatures in various places to survive this great calamity, there might have been no more weak creatures in the space-time dimension after a few dozen days. Is there an end to this? Someone finally couldn't take it anymore and suddenly roared. This voice directly spread throughout the space-time dimension, allowing all the living beings in the space-time dimension to hear this voice in an instant. Even Luo Fan and the others in the Stone Forest Forbidden Area. All of them had heard this sound as well. In an instant, the tremors stopped slightly. The entire space-time dimension was at this moment. It finally obtained a peace that they hadn't felt for dozens of days. This change, which should have made all living beings feel relaxed, didn't make any living beings feel relaxed at this moment. There was only a sense of oppression that came before a storm. Immediately after, there was a loud rumble. Somewhere in the space-time dimension, the body of the living being that had roared just now suddenly exploded, turning into a huge mushroom cloud that soared into the sky. This caused the space-time dimension to once again experience indescribable tremors. In fact, this time, it was even more intense and terrifying than before. The impact will be even worse. For a time, apart from this tremor, there was no other movement in the space-time dimension. No other living beings dared to speak again. All of them silently carried on with what they were doing. Why bother? At this moment, in the Stone Forest Forbidden Area, Luo Fan sighed. The one who had wiped out the person who had spoken just now was naturally not him, but the Lord of the Forbidden Area, the living being from another perfect world. As for how it had used this attack, it didn't rely on any direct method to bypass him and launch an attack. Instead, it relied on the source of a voice and used that person's roar as a guide to transmit the attack through that voice. That was why it was so straightforward and easy to destroy that living being and completely erase all traces of its existence. This attack was extremely strange. It was similar to a curse, but it was even more mysterious than a curse. This was also the first time that living being had used this attack. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan didn't notice it earlier and missed this attack, causing that living being to suffer an unexpected disaster. However, this was only just now. Now that he had seen this attack, if this attack wanted to be effective again, regardless of whether it was against him or others, Luo Fan had enough power to destroy it and intercept it. "You destroyed my world," the Lord of the Forbidden Area said. This was the first time he had spoken in the past few dozen days. As he spoke, his figure gradually appeared behind the vortex. However, this time, he was no longer in the world behind the vortex. Instead, he was behind the vortex in the space-time dimension that Luo Fan was in. The aura of the world that Luo Fan had seen before faintly spread from his body that had already become extremely huge. Luo Fan could tell with a single glance that this was a sign that he had completely devoured that world. "I destroyed your world? You seem to have destroyed that world yourself, right?" "All I did was take a look," Luo Fan said calmly. As he spoke, he casually clenched his hand and crushed the formless, terrifying attack that the other party had sent out, causing the surrounding space-time dimension to ripple slightly. As the living being spoke, he didn't stop his attack. At this moment, an indescribable hatred appeared in the living being's eyes. He said, "It was your gaze that destroyed my world." As he roared, a strange flame suddenly ignited on his body. Chapter 1845. This kind of flame was burning so fiercely that even an existence like Luo Fan could feel an indescribable heat invading his body from the surroundings. It must be known that Luo Fan was a powerful existence that had survived the Second Great Tribulation. To make him feel scorching hot and unbearable was something that could only be found in the Great Calamity. However, in this place, the flames ignited on the body of this creature from another perfect world could actually do this. It was able to make him feel as if his body was about to be ignited. The power and terror of this flame was self-evident. At this moment, Luo Fan finally felt that this was the first time he had encountered this creature. Die! The creature roared, and the flames around its body surged wildly. They quickly gathered in midair and finally turned into a ball. It appeared in the shape of a ball and crashed towards Luo Fan. During this process, all the surrounding space-time dimensions, all the power, and even the existence of everything after they were destroyed could not have any effect on the ball of light formed by this flame. This allowed the flame to penetrate everything and brazenly arrive in front of Luo Fan, instantly wrapping him in it. An indescribable heat crazily poured into Luo Fan's body, quickly impacting the composition of his body. Even the endless power inside his body was triggered at this moment, producing all kinds of abnormal changes. It faintly impacted everything around him, causing the surrounding space and time to appear out of thin air. However, in the blink of an eye, they completely disappeared under the burning of the flames. This kind of flame was increasing crazily at this moment, as if there was no limit and no boundary. As the power of the flame increased, the light emitted by the flame became more and more intense, more and more dazzling. Finally, at a certain moment, the flame finally broke through its limit. Instead, it formed a huge black hole that did not emit any light. No heat was emitted. This was none other than the existence in the middle of the transmission of light, and heat had been completely burned by this flame and could no longer exist. Even the existence in the middle of the transmission of light and heat could no longer exist. This position had naturally turned into a black hole. What a powerful flame. It's definitely not a flame that this space-time, this world should have. Luo Fan thought to himself. With this thought in mind, his mind began to move. He began to use all of his thoughts and effort to ponder, to find the truth behind the various flames around him. During this process, the flames were constantly destroying his body. His body gradually melted during this process. His body gradually lost its form. The boundless might in his body and the worldview that had already fused with his body also suffered an indescribably huge impact during this process, and it faintly showed signs of wavering. Such a terrifying injury. Even during the Great Tribulation, it didn't appear on him at the beginning. At this moment, the creature that was emitting these flames, an indescribable malevolence, appeared on the face of the existence that came from another perfect world. A look of delight could be seen in his eyes. However, he was not an ordinary person after all. After all, he was an existence whose cultivation had reached an extremely high level. At this moment, he did not hysterically shout things like die, die, die like other people would. Instead, he also used his thoughts in a frenzy, frantically searching for all the changes that Luo Fan had revealed. Through these changes, he searched for the various roots and essences behind these changes, so as to further harm Luo Fan and further achieve his goal of revenge. After all, Luo Fan's current situation looked extremely tragic. It was hard to deal with, but that was only on the surface. Fundamentally speaking, Luo Fan had yet to suffer any truly irreparable injuries. But how could this satisfy the Lord of the Restricted Zone? *T. At this moment, Qing Longzi finally reacted. He cried out in shock and was about to attack the fireball. But at this moment, the air hostess raised her hand and pulled him back. There's no need to attack. He can deal with it. When Qing Longzi looked at her with a shocked and uncertain gaze, the air hostess stated her reason. These words caused Qing Longzi to be suddenly stunned. She turned her head to look at Miao, who was beside her, and found that although Miao looked worried, it was only a little and not to the extent that she was so worried that she would overestimate herself and want to attack. Are you really that confident in him? She felt that it was a little unbelievable. It was a good thing to have confidence, and it could even be said that it was natural. However, to have such confidence to the extent that they even allowed the other party to be attacked and did not care about the other party's incomparably wretched state, it was clearly a little too much. You haven't seen the tribulation he encountered before. Wen Miao sighed at this moment and said, "Tribulation." Qing Longzi seemed to be deep in thought, and his heart was filled with a desire to investigate. What kind of inconceivable tribulation must he have experienced for them to have such strong confidence in him? Could it be that that tribulation was dozens of times stronger than the flames that would completely destroy her if she came into contact with it? Under these various probing emotions, she stopped herself from attacking. Although her eyes were still filled with bewilderment, she still stood beside the air hostess and Wen Miao, quietly watching the changes that would inevitably shock her. The black hole formed by the flames hung in the boundless chaos for several days. Just when the worry in Wen Miao's eyes had increased to a certain limit, and she almost couldn't help but attack, a change finally began to appear on the black hole. That black hole gradually began to squirm, and faint traces of flames began to leak out from it. They continuously attacked the surrounding space-time dimensional fragments and the surrounding power fragments, causing the space-time dimensional fragments and power fragments to start a new combination, gradually forming a completely different space-time dimensional fragment. They formed various kinds of power, combining into unknown space-time and heaven and earth. Although these space-time and heaven and earth couldn't exist stably under the flames. Very quickly, they disappeared under the burning of the flames and were erased. But compared to the original absolute darkness, it was already enough to shock the air hostess and the others. Following these changes, the distance between the flames and them seemed to have been pulled further apart. Originally, it was only a few dozen feet away from them, but now it felt like it was hundreds of millions of light years away. If it weren't for the fact that none of them were ordinary cultivators, perhaps they wouldn't have been able to see the existence of this ball of flames at this moment. The amount of the flames leaking out rapidly increased. Not long after, the black hole completely collapsed and was completely replaced by the flames. Then, within the flames, a vague figure began to gradually condense from a ball of paste, taking shape once again. After dozens of breaths, that figure truly stabilized. His face had also been completely revealed, becoming incomparably clear. It was Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan opened his hand, and on his palm, there was a ball of flames that was brighter and more dazzling than the surroundings. It was constantly growing. Not only was the light of the surrounding flames weakening, but the heat was also decreasing. Combined with the fact that the heat was also decreasing, it felt as though the ball of flame in his palm was devouring the endless flames around it. Another figure with an octopus head gradually emerged from the flames. This figure was completely condensed from the flames. It was extremely clear and obvious in the huge ball of flames. At this moment, his body was extremely distorted, as if he was resisting some kind of extremely terrifying suction force, struggling to escape from something. And looking at the direction he was escaping from, it was impressively the ball of flames in Luo Fan's hand. Obviously, the ball of flames in Luo Fan's hand was really swallowing the endless flames around it. Although this creature wanted to escape from the swallowing of the ball of flames, it was a pity that over the past few days, through his own comprehension, Luo Fan had already grasped the true essence of this ball of flames. Now, he had already relied on his own worldview to restructure this ball of flames. And his ability to control it. He had long surpassed its original owner, which was to say, this was the creature itself. Under such circumstances, no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't escape from the swallowing of this ball of flames. He could only watch helplessly as his body continued to be sucked into the flames and gradually disappeared without a trace. In the end, in just a short 2 hours, the huge ball of flames had completely disappeared. Luo Fan's figure reappeared in front of everyone without any obstruction. However, the ball of flames in his hand had already turned into an existence that resembled a black hole. Only the wisps of aura that belonged to that creature still existed within it. This appearance was simply a microcosm of the state that Luo Fan was in when he was swallowed by the ball of flames previously. It was just that the roles had been reversed now. With the appearance of Luo Fan, the absolute chaos in the surroundings began to gradually calm down. The fragments of the space-time dimension gradually condensed again, and the incredible power also gradually dissipated. As for the turbulence that constantly echoed throughout the space-time dimension, it completely disappeared at this moment. In the end, it didn't take long before the Stone Forest's Forbidden Zone gradually stabilized. However, the horror of the Forbidden Zone had completely disappeared and was replaced by an ordinary stone forest formed by space-time dimensional fragments. It's finally over. For a time, countless creatures throughout the space-time dimension heaved a long sigh of relief. All of them had the same thought in their minds. After experiencing the destruction of several Forbidden Zones, they had never looked forward to the disappearance of a Forbidden Zone as much as they did this time. When all these changes calmed down, all sorts of complicated emotions were born from all over the place. Some were sadness, some were joy, some were anger, and some were hatred. All sorts of emotions were born because of the many creatures that died in the turbulence just now. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an inexplicable expression on his face. There was only an indescribable expression on his face as he said, "Which world are you from?" His voice pierced through the flames. It entered the ears of the creature in the flames. At this moment, the air hostess and the others had already surrounded him. He looked at the ball of flame in Luo Fan's hand with an extremely curious gaze. Of course, Luo Fan didn't get an answer to his question. At this moment, Qing Longzi asked, "What kind of flame is this? How can it have such a terrifying power?" Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Don't you find this kind of flame very familiar?" Qing Longzi frowned. This answer was obviously not what she wanted. However, it was obvious that she was the one asking for advice. How could he transfer money? Naturally, she could only listen to him. At this moment, she could only use her brain to think carefully about this kind of flame. Well, had she seen something like this before? After all, she was a disciple of a true saint and had seen a lot of things. After thinking for a while, she suddenly revealed a look of disbelief and said, "This is karmic fire. How is this possible? How can the power of the karmic fire be strengthened to such an extent?" Her words caused both the Air Maiden and Miao to reveal looks of surprise. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, the karmic fire was an absolutely terrifying flame. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, the karmic fire was an absolutely terrifying flame. It could even be said that it was an unsolvable flame. However, this was only in the eyes of ordinary living beings or ordinary cultivators. In fact, it didn't even need to be a false saint or a false saint. As long as a cultivator reached the sage-to-be level, they could already ignore this kind of karmic fire. In other words, even if they fell into the karmic fire and let it burn for billions of years, it wouldn't cause any harm to them. Even a sage-to-be could do this, let alone them who were at least at the Supreme Emperor level at this moment. However, the power of the flame just now was so terrifying that it had even hurt Luo Fan. It even made Qing Longzi feel that if she was not careful and touched it even a little, her body and spirit might be destroyed. Such a flame. The power of the karmic fire was obviously worlds apart from what they knew. How could they believe that this was the karmic fire? Luo Fan heard this. He just smiled and said, "Of course it's the karmic fire. However, it has an essential difference from the karmic fire in your understanding. This is a kind of karmic fire from another perfect world. It has been tempered by the chaos and is stained with a bit of the characteristics of the chaos. The karmic fire can withstand the tempering of the chaos." Qing Longzi frowned. The karmic fire was such a fragile existence that it couldn't even withstand the crushing of her power. No matter how much karmic fire there was, as long as she suppressed it with a bit of her power, it would be completely destroyed and disappear. She believed that such a karmic fire could withstand the tempering of the chaos and still exist after going through the chaos. However, she didn't believe it at all. If it's simply throwing the karmic fire into the chaos, it naturally won't remain. However, if an expert uses himself as a sacrifice and sacrifices himself to the chaos, then the appearance of this karmic fire is natural. Luo Fan just smiled faintly. Sacrifices to the chaos. Qing Longzi's eyes were filled with astonishment. Even though she was a disciple of a true saint, she had only heard of such a method and didn't understand it. Now, she could actually see the results of such a sacrifice. I didn't expect you to know so much. At this moment, a voice came from the ball of flame on Luo Fan's palm. Along with this voice, the ball of flame, or rather, the black hole, faintly emitted wisps of flames. In the void, they gradually condensed into a figure with an octopus head and 3 arms. At this moment, this figure had a look of shock and uncertainty on its face. It seemed to have some kind of conjecture, as if it didn't dare to believe its own conjecture. You must come from a great world, right? Luo Fan looked at this person and said faintly, "You really aren't a native of this world." The octopus creature finally said in shock, "Native?" This word made Qing Longzi and the others frown. The word native was usually used when a creature with a higher level of civilization looked at a creature with a lower level of civilization. Now that this person said that he was a native of this perfect world, it was clear that he thought that his level of civilization was several levels higher than that of this perfect world. This, to the people who had always thought highly of themselves, was simply a huge blow. It was enough to make them feel indescribable anger in their hearts. This kind of attitude of being superior to the perfect world is indeed the expression of a creature in the great world. Luo Fan said at this time. The creature looked at Luo Fan and said, "Since you are not a native of this perfect world, why are you going against me? Have you not heard of the name of my great God refining world? So you are from the great God refining world. However, it's a pity that I am ignorant and do not know what great God refining world is." Luo Fan smiled faintly. "Humph. My great God refining world has 3,000 true saints. They are incomparably powerful and are the rulers of this piece of chaos. In any great world, there will definitely be legends of the great God refining world. You actually haven't heard of it. It seems that you're either a native from another perfect world, or you snuck in from outside this area." The person from the great God refining world looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable expression. His eyes seemed to be mixed with contempt and bewilderment. From this look, it was obvious that he couldn't tell what kind of situation Luo Fan was in.